Elden Ring contains more magic systems than almost any other game from software has ever made, and each one is tied to a faction, a god, or a piece of forgotten history that the game almost never explains out loud. So tonight, we're going through all of it. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. Now, a quick word from me as the person who actually made this video. I have been sitting with Elden Ring's lore for a long time, and the magic systems specifically kept pulling me back because they are not just gameplay tools. Every single spell category in this game is a window into a civilization, a belief system, or a tragedy. When I was putting this together, I made a deliberate choice to organize everything not by how strong the spells are in the game, but by where they come from in the world's history. So you will notice we move roughly from older to newer, from the foundations of the lands between Outward toward the present day of the game. I also made the choice to lean into the interpretive nature of all of this. From software writes their lore in fragments, in item descriptions, in environmental details, and in things characters almost say, but never quite finish saying. So when I present something in this video, understand that it is my reading of the available evidence. I will try to flag when something is genuinely ambiguous versus when most people tend to agree on an interpretation. With that said, let's get into it. What magic actually is in the lands. Before we talk about any specific type of magic, it helps to understand what the game seems to think magic fundamentally is. In Elden Ring, magic is not something that exists outside of the world's power structures. It is deeply tied to them. Almost every spell category in the game traces back to some god, some primordial force, or some institution that developed and formalized it. There is very little in the way of what you might call wild or neutral magic. Almost everything has an origin, and almost every origin is political in some way. The broadest division the game makes is between sorceries and incantations. Sorceries, broadly speaking, are intellectual magic. They are studied, developed, and practiced through the mind. The catalyst for them is typically a staff, and they scale with intelligence. The lore framing around sorceries is that they are about understanding and manipulating the fundamental fabric of reality through reason and scholarship. Incantations, on the other hand, are devotional magic. They are given, received, bestowed. The catalyst is a seal, and they scale with faith. They represent magic that flows from something greater than the individual practitioner, whether that something is a god, a dragon, a primordial force, or even a kind of madness. That divide between knowing and believing runs all the way through the game's magic design, and it is worth keeping in mind as we go through each type. There is also a third layer worth mentioning before we dive in. Some magic in Elden Ring exists at the intersection of both systems, or outside of them entirely. Some things are neither fully sorcery nor fully incantation by the game's categorization, and those edge cases are often where the most interesting lore lives. We will get to those as we go. Now, one more thing. The lands between. At the time of the game, is a world in complete collapse. The Erd Tree, which served as the central power structure for essentially all organized religion and governance, has been corrupted. The Elden Ring, which is the fundamental law of reality itself, has been shattered. Every major faction is either dead, dying, or fighting over what comes next. The magic systems we're going to talk about did not develop in this context of ruin. Most of them developed in much older, more stable times. So as we go through them, try to imagine them in their original context, when the institutions behind them were functioning, when their practitioners were thriving, when the world they were built for still made sense. Glintstone sorcery, the foundation of scholarly magic. Let us start with glintstone sorcery, because in many ways it is the most iconic magic type in the game, the one most associated with the word sorcery in the lands between, and the one with the deepest institutional roots. Glintstone itself is the key to understanding this magic. Item descriptions in the game suggest that glintstone is crystallized starlight. It is matter that has fallen from the heavens over immense spans of time, slowly accumulating in the earth of the lands between and taking on physical form. The stones glow with an inner light, and that light is not decorative. It is the actual substance being manipulated when a sorcerer casts a glintstone spell. When a scholar holds a staff and channels a glintstone pebble or a glintstone arc, they are drawing on the energy contained within that crystallized starlight and projecting it outward. This is a meaningful cosmological claim. Stars in Elden Ring are not just decorative features of the sky. The game hints across many item descriptions and character dialogues that stars are connected to fate, to the ordering of reality, to forces that predate even the Erdtree. By rooting their primary sorcery tradition in the manipulation of crystallized starlight, the scholars of the lands between were not just being poetic. They were making a claim about the nature of what they were doing. They were saying that their magic was as fundamental as the cosmos itself. The glintstone embedded in a sorcerer's forehead is one of the most visually distinctive elements of the magic users you encounter in the game. Scholars who have dedicated themselves to sorcery at the highest levels carry glintstone directly in their bodies. The Academy of Raya Lucaria, which we will talk about extensively in a moment, describes this as a mark of intellectual dedication, a physical merging of the scholar with the subject of their study. But there is something slightly unsettling about it too, and the game seems to want you to notice that. Item descriptions for various glintstone-related equipment hint that the stone is not entirely passive. There are suggestions that extended exposure to glintstone can alter a person, that the boundary between the scholar and the stone becomes blurry over time. The basic glintstone spells, the pebbles and arcs and stars, are the most accessible expression of this magic. They are the introductory vocabulary of a much larger language. A scholar who has just begun their studies learns to project the energy of glintstone in these simple forms, getting a feel for how the material responds to mental direction. The more advanced glintstone spells require not just more energy, but a more sophisticated understanding of how starlight energy behaves and can be shaped. Glintstone spells, in terms of their lore function, tend to represent precision and analysis. They are not wild or emotional magic. They are the product of careful study and methodical practice. The intelligent scaling in the game reflects this. It takes a particular kind of mind to manipulate glintstone effectively, and the game suggests it is less about innate talent and more about sustained intellectual development. There are multiple subfamilies within glintstone sorcery. You have the basic projections, the streams, the shards, the concentrated beams. You have the more complex geometries, the arcs and stars that suggest the sorcerer is working with the underlying structure of the energy rather than just blasting it forward. And then you have the more esoteric applications that blur into neighbouring categories, like the comet spells, which we will look at more closely when we get to primeval sorcery, since those represent a different branch of the same tree. The other thing worth noting about glintstone sorcery specifically is that it is academy sorcery. It was formalized, catalogued, taught, and graduated in institutional settings. Unlike some of the more fringe magic systems in the game, glintstone sorcery has a curriculum. There are beginner spells and advanced spells. There are teachers and students. There is peer review of a kind. This institutional backbone is both its greatest strength and the source of some of its greatest limitations. It excels within the boundaries of what the Academy understood. It struggles to account for things that fall outside those boundaries, and as we will see, quite a lot falls outside those boundaries. The Academy of Raya Lucaria, a civilization built on stars. You cannot talk about glintstone sorcery without talking about Raya Lucaria, because the Academy is not just where glintstone sorcery is studied. It is, in a very real sense, the reason glintstone sorcery exists in its current form. The Academy did not discover the energy of glintstone. That energy predates the institution by a very long time, but the Academy organised it. It took something diffuse and potentially dangerous and gave it structure, gave it pedagogy, gave it a tradition. Raya Lucaria sits in the middle of Liurnia of the Lakes, built on and around a massive stone formation that suggests geological upheaval long in the past. The architecture of the Academy is grandiose in a way that reflects genuine wealth and power. This was not a small institution operating on the margins of lands between society. At its height, Raya Lucaria was a major geopolitical force, wealthy enough to commission extraordinary infrastructure, influential enough to negotiate on equal terms with the Erdtree and its servants. The founding of the Academy is not spelled out clearly, which is typical for this game, but the picture that emerges from various descriptions suggests it grew out of an existing tradition of glintstone study, probably originating with those who first recognized that the stones carried manipulable energy. Over time, these practitioners gathered, shared knowledge, built structures to support their work, attracted students. What began as informal collaboration gradually formalized into something with governance, with property, with a name. By the time of the game's present, the Academy has been in operation for an extremely long time. It has seen generations of scholars pass through. It has developed internal traditions and internal disputes and internal politics. The senior scholars, often referred to as full moon scholars or distinguished members of the faculty, have achieved a level of mastery that puts them in a different category from ordinary practitioners. Some of them have pushed so far into glintstone research that the line between studying the material and being consumed by it has started to blur. The Academy's relationship with the Erdtree is complicated and genuinely interesting. For most of the Academy's history, the scholars of Raya Lucaria were technically subject to the Golden Order, the religious and political framework centered on the Erdtree. But the Academy always maintained a degree of institutional independence that made that subjection largely nominal. The scholars were not believers in the way the Golden Order demanded. They were rationalists. They believed in empirical study and the power of intellect over revelation. The Erdtree represented something quite different, a faith tradition rooted in the blessing of the Elden Ring and the intercession of the two fingers. These were not things the Academy took on faith, they examined them. This tension was eventually resolved, at least on paper, through marriage. Radagon of the Golden Order, who was at that time the consort of Queen Marika, and later became something even more complicated, married Renala, the Queen of the Full Moon, and the most powerful sorcerer the Academy had ever produced. This marriage was a political arrangement in the tradition of uniting great powers through personal union, and it worked for a time. Radagon left Renala to return to Marika, and the wound that left on the Academy was significant. Renala retreated into a kind of private grief, and the Academy eventually fell into the disarray you find it in when you arrive as the Tarnished. But the Academy's legacy in terms of magic is enormous. The entire glintstone sorcery curriculum, the spells, the staves, the methods, the theory, all of it was systematized by Raya Lucaria. If you are casting any glintstone spell in the game, you are working within a framework that was built and maintained by that institution. Even the sorceries that the Academy eventually departed from or rejected, the night sorceries, the primeval sorceries, the full moon sorceries, exist in relation to the Academy. They are either the Academy's esoteric inner circle or the traditions that grew up in opposition to it. Carian sorcery, the royal house, and its particular magic. Carian sorcery is what you might call the aristocratic branch of glintstone scholarship, where the Academy represents the broadly accessible institutional tradition with students from various backgrounds admitted on the basis of aptitude. Carian sorcery represents a more exclusive tradition tied specifically to the Carian royal family and their lineage. The Carians ruled over the area that would become Liurnia for a very long time before Raya Lucaria was established as a formal institution. They were a dynasty of powerful sorcerers in their own right, and their magic developed along a particular path shaped by their specific relationship to the night sky and to the moon in particular. Item descriptions associated with Carian spells and equipment repeatedly invoke the night, the dark sky, the moon's light. The Carians did not just work with glintstone, they worked with a particular frequency or quality of starlight that came specifically from the moon, or at least that is how their tradition framed it. This distinction matters because it gave Carian sorcery a different character from standard glintstone work. Standard glintstone sorcery tends to project discrete bolts or streams of energy. Carian sorcery, at its most distinctive, manifests the magic as blades and weapons. The Carian slicer, the Carian greatsword, Carian phalanx, these are spells that create constructs of moonlit magic and use them as cutting or thrusting implements. There is something in the visual language of these spells that suggests a different philosophy from the projection-based approach of standard glintstone work. Rather than hurling the energy at a target, the Carian tradition shapes it into a form that requires proximity. It is more intimate in a way, more personal. The bladed nature of Carian sorcery also connects to the family's identity as nobles and warriors, as well as scholars. The Carian knights, who serve as formidable enemies throughout Liurnia, are closely associated with their lord's sorcery tradition. They may not be sorcerers themselves, but they carry equipment marked by Carian aesthetics and fight in service of a dynasty that was always as much a martial power as an intellectual one. Carian sorcery suggests a family that wanted their magic to be both scholarly and dangerous in a direct, immediate way. Queen Renala is the apex of the Carian line in the game's present. She is described as having mastered the full moon, which is the highest expression of Carian sorcery. Her mother Ranala before her was similarly accomplished, and the tradition, presumably, stretches back through the royal line for many generations. Renala is also the one who gave birth to 3 children, each of whom represents a different relationship with their mother's magical heritage. Rani the Witch embraced sorcery and became one of the most powerful practitioners in the game. Rykard, the Lord of Blasphemy, went in a very different direction, abandoning the Eard Tree and eventually merging with a serpent god. Radan took his father Radagon's inclination toward physical combat and fused it with gravity sorcery, becoming a scholar warrior of a completely different type. Renala herself, by the time you encounter her, is broken in a deeply sad way. She sits in the Grand Library of Raya Lucaria, holding an amber egg, surrounded by her students who have regressed to almost childlike states to remain loyal to her. She is not the imperious academic she once was. She is someone who loved deeply, lost terribly, and never found a way back from that loss. Her magic is still there, still immense, but it is entangled with grief. She still has the power to rebirth, to use the amber egg as a vessel for renewed life, and that becomes mechanically important for the player character. But the majesty that she presumably once carried has curdled into something that hovers between tragic and haunting. The Carian royal family's specific contribution to magic, beyond their personal spells, is the idea that sorcery can be a dynastic identity. Other people, in the lands between, studied glintstone as scholars. The Carians were glintstone sorcerers as a matter of birthright and royal pride. That made their tradition more conservative in some ways, more focused on refining and perfecting specific techniques that carried the family's aesthetic, rather than exploring the full breadth of what glintstone energy could do. Full moon sorceries, the pinnacle of Carian achievements. Full moon sorceries represent the highest tier of the Carian magical tradition. They are, in the lore of the game, not just strong spells, but the culminating expression of a lifetime of mastery. Renala possesses one full moon sorcery, the Renala's full moon, and it is presented in her boss fight as her ultimate weapon. The full moon aspect is not just a naming convention. It reflects the Carian belief that there is a particular kind of power accessible at the full moon, a clarity and intensity of moonlight that a master sorcerer can access and channel in a way that ordinary practitioners cannot. The full moon in Elden Ring's cosmology is not a mundane astronomical object. The moon and the stars, as we touched on earlier, with glintstone, carry cosmological weight in this world. The game hints at forces connected to the outer stars, to things beyond the sky, and the moon sits at an interesting position in that framework, close enough to see from the ground, far enough to carry some of that otherworldly quality. Carian sorcery positions the moon as a kind of lens or amplifier for starlight energy, and the full moon specifically as the moment when that amplification is at its peak. Ranni's full moon spell is a variant of the same tradition. Ranni the witch, Renala's daughter, carries the Carian magical heritage forward in her own way. She is technically no longer in her original body, having performed a ritual that let her discard her flesh and become a will within a doll's body. But she maintains access to the moonlight magic of her lineage, and her personal spell reflects her particular position in the world. Where Renala's full moon is grand and sweeping, the product of a queen at the height of her power, Ranni's magic has a colder, more deliberate quality. Her plan throughout the game is intricate and long-laid, and her sorcery reflects that precision. There is also the Dark Moon Greatsword, which is a weapon associated with Ranni's questline and represents a different expression of full moon sorcery. The blade is infused with moonlight in a way that persists and can be deployed in a specific weapon skill. It is one of the most lore-significant weapons in the game, tied to a covenant that appears across multiple From Software games in various forms. The Dark Moon here reflects the difference between Ranni's vision, a moon shrouded in darkness rather than shining in its full brightness, a light that illuminates but does not warm. The full moon sorceries as a category suggests something important about how the Carians understood magical advancement. It was not just about learning more spells or accessing more power in a linear sense. It was about reaching a qualitative threshold where the practitioner's connection to the moon was so complete that they could summon its full expression. This is a different philosophy from the Academy's more curriculum-based progression. The Carians were not counting spell slots and studying textbooks. They were cultivating a relationship with the night sky itself. There is also the question of what the full moon means in terms of the outer gods, the beings from beyond the world that Elden Ring hints at but rarely addresses directly. The moon in several From Software games has been associated with beings of immense alien power, and Elden Ring carries some of that tradition forward. The Carian royal family's deep connection to the moon may not have been purely self-contained. It may have placed them in proximity to forces they did not fully understand, forces that had their own interests in the lands between. This is one of the more speculative readings of the Carian tradition, but it is supported by the way certain lore items describe the outer stars and their relationship to fate and to sorcery. Night sorceries, the hidden half of glintstone magic. Night sorceries exist in a peculiar position within the broader glintstone tradition. They are clearly related to standard glintstone and Carian sorcery. They share the same basic mechanism of channeling starlight energy, but they have been developed in a particular direction that makes them quite distinct in both effect and implication. Where standard glintstone sorcery is bright, projecting visible bolts and beams of light, night sorceries are dark. The unseen form spell is a perfect example. It renders the caster partially invisible. The Night Maiden and Swordstress puppets reference, the Knight's Cavalry enemy type, the Black Knife Assassins, all of these are connected to a tradition associated with concealment, with darkness, with the hidden side of things. Night sorceries lean into that association deliberately. The unseen blade spell coats a weapon in a darkened energy that makes it hard for enemies to track. The black blade spells, while technically incantations tied to a different tradition, share an aesthetic with night sorceries that is worth noticing. There is a consistent visual and thematic vocabulary around darkness and concealment in the game that cuts across multiple magic categories, and the night sorceries sits squarely in the middle of that vocabulary. Where do night sorceries come from in terms of the world's history? This is where things get genuinely murky, and I want to be honest that what follows is more interpretive than some of what we have already discussed. The game strongly suggests a connection between night sorceries and the events surrounding the Night of the Black Knives, the assassination of Godwyn the Golden and the theft of the Rune of Death. Ranni is implicated in that night, and Ranni is a Carian sorceress who has gone in a direction that her mother's tradition only partially explains. The Black Knife assassins who carried out the killings used magic that shares aesthetic qualities with night sorceries: the concealment, the darkness, the blade-based application. One reading of this is that Ranni, or those working with her, developed night sorceries specifically for the purpose of that night: tools for hiding, for moving unseen, for striking without being tracked. Another reading is that night sorceries existed already as an esoteric branch of Carian magic and were simply repurposed for those events. The game does not give us enough to be certain, and that ambiguity seems intentional. The night sorceries that the player can actually use in the game are relatively few compared to other categories. Unseen Form, Unseen Blade, Night Comet, Night Maiden's Mist, Ranni's Dark Moon, if you want to count it in this category. But their thematic density is high. Each one tells you something about the tradition they come from, about a branch of glintstone scholarship that went underground, literally in some cases, and developed tools for a different kind of power than the bright projections of the Academy. Night Comet is particularly interesting because it takes the basic comet sorcery concept, which belongs to the primeval sorcery tradition, and applies the night quality to it. Where a regular comet is visible, trackable, defensive able, the night comet is harder to see. The comet form suggests immense concentrated power. The night quality makes that power harder to avoid. It is the product of someone thinking carefully about how to combine two different magical traditions into something more effective than either would be alone. Night sorceries also have a connection to the Nokron and Nokstellar underground civilizations, the eternal cities buried beneath the lands between. Those cities are strange twilight places that exist perpetually in artificial night. Some of their residents practice their own versions of glintstone sorcery, influenced by the particular conditions of underground life and by their proximity to the Fingerslayer blade and other deeply charged artifacts. The sorceries that emerge from those environments have an affinity with night sorceries, even when they are technically separate traditions. The darkness shapes the magic, or perhaps the magic shapes the environment. In those underground cities, it is hard to tell which came first. Gravity sorceries, a scholar who could hold back the stars. Gravity sorceries are one of the most specific magic traditions in the game because they are almost entirely associated with a single person. Star Scourge Radan, one of the demigods, and the child of Renala and Radagon, is the most famous practitioner of gravity magic. He is described as having studied gravity sorceries in Celia in Caelid before the Shattering, and having mastered them to such a degree that he could hold back the stars themselves, preventing celestial bodies from moving and falling and disrupting the lands between. To understand why that matters, you need to understand a bit about what Radan was afraid would happen if the stars moved. Ranni's questline, which we will return to several times throughout this video, involves her liberation from the influence of the two fingers and from the fate that was assigned to her. Part of that plan involved the movement of a specific star, the star that carries something important to her goals. Radharn, perhaps foreseeing this, or perhaps for his own reasons, was keeping the stars fixed. His gravity magic was not being used for offense or defense in the conventional sense. It was being used as a cosmological anchor. The gravity sorceries themselves, the spells the player can use, deal with the manipulation of gravitational forces in fairly direct ways. Gravity well pulls enemies toward the caster. Collapsing stars create small singularities that drag targets inward. Rocksling pulls up chunks of earth from the ground and hurls them with tremendous force, using gravity as both the extraction mechanism and the propulsion. Meteorite of Astal calls down fragments of a destroyed alien entity and drives them into the earth around a target. That last one is particularly interesting in terms of lore because Astal, natural born of the void, is one of the most alien-seeming creatures in the entire game. It is a being from outside the world, connected to the outer stars, and it appears in the context of Ranni's questline in an area deep underground. The spell that invokes Astel's meteorites suggests a connection between gravity sorcery and the forces from beyond the sky, which makes a certain cosmological sense. Gravity is, after all, the force that governs celestial mechanics, the pull between masses, the physics of orbits and impacts. A magic system built on gravity is naturally a magic system, with one foot pointed toward the stars. Radharn's personal application of gravity sorcery extended to the Marshal. He used it to keep himself mounted on his horse Leonard, who would have been crushed under Radharn's immense weight otherwise. This is such a specific and strangely poignant detail. Here is one of the most powerful demigods in the world, a warrior whose physical presence is so overwhelming that it defies the structural limits of ordinary matter, and what he chooses to use his gravity mastery for, on a personal level, is staying on a horse he clearly loves. Leonard persists through the Radharn fight, still carrying his deteriorated master, even after the scarlet rot has reduced Radharn to a monstrous state. The gravity magic that kept their bond physically possible is baked into the relationship between them. Radharn's study of gravity sorceries at Sellia is worth dwelling on for a moment. Sellia, town of sorcery, is a location in Caelid, now largely ruined and overrun. It suggests that before the shattering and the spread of the scarlet rot, Caelid had a significant sorcery tradition of its own. The specific branch practiced there, gravity sorceries, places Sellia in an interesting position relative to Raya Lucaria. The Academy focused on glintstone, in a general sense, on starlight energy and its many applications. Sellia seems to have gone deep on one specific application of that energy, the gravitational manipulation. This kind of regional specialization within the broader glintstone tradition makes sense for a world that had many centers of learning, even if Raya Lucaria was the largest and most prestigious. The meteorite staff, which is particularly effective for gravity sorceries, is found in the early game in a location that suggests it may have been dropped by someone fleeing Sellia or the devastation of Caelid. The staff itself is described as being made of meteorite ore, which connects it physically to the fallen material that gravity sorceries manipulate. Using it feels appropriate in a way that goes beyond the gameplay stats. You are channeling gravity magic with a staff made of matter that arrived on the planet because of gravity. Death sorceries, the rune that was stolen. Death sorceries are perhaps the most politically and historically charged magic category in the game, because their existence is tied to one of the most consequential events in Elden Ring's history. The Rune of Death was originally contained within the Elden Ring, the fundamental law governing the lands between. Under that governance, death in the lands between was not final. The Erd Tree would absorb the dead and recycle their grace, keeping souls in a vast loop of renewal rather than allowing them to pass on permanently. This is the system that the Golden Order maintained and celebrated. Marika, for reasons that the game points toward, but does not fully explain, removed the Rune of Death from the Elden Ring and entrusted it to Malekith, her Black Blade Shadow. Malekith was to guard it, ensure it was never used, never returned to the world in a way that could threaten the cycle. For a time this arrangement held, but the Rune of Death was, in some sense, always straining against its containment, and there were those who knew it existed and wanted to use it. The Gloam-eyed Queen is a figure who barely appears in the game directly, but whose shadow falls over enormous amounts of the lore. She was a practitioner of black flame incantations, which we will discuss separately, and she was apparently the one who originally wielded destined death in a form that threatened the entire system. Mariketh defeated her, which is how he came to guard the rune in the first place. But before her defeat, she or her followers developed or possessed something that the game calls destined death, a manifestation of the death that was supposed to be part of the world, but had been removed. The Black Knives, the assassins who killed Godwyn on the night of the Black Knives, used knives imbued with a fragment of the Rune of Death. This is where Ranni comes in. The night was orchestrated to separate a soul from a body in a way that the Golden Order's system could not account for. Godwyn's body continued to exist, animating slowly into the Prince of Death, while his soul was destroyed. Ranni's body was killed, but her soul survived, transferred to a doll. The Rune of Death was the tool that made this possible, that allowed for a death outside the normal parameters of the Erd Tree's recycling. Death sorceries, as the player actually uses them, are the practical manifestation of channeling that rune's energy. The Tibia's summons, the death lightning spells, in their incantation form, the explosive ghost flame, the ancient death rancor, all of these draw on the energy of the Rune of Death to cause a specific kind of damage. Death Blight, the status effect associated with these spells, is interesting mechanically because it does not just reduce health, it causes instant death if the meter fills, bypassing the normal framework of combat. It is, in a sense, the most direct magical expression of what the Rune of Death does. It imposes finality in a world where finality had been removed. The sorceries in this category specifically, as opposed to the incantations, tend to come from the Round Table Hold derelict area and from the wandering mausoleums and death-associated locations across the game. They are magic that someone had to work out how to channel without necessarily having official sanction, since the Rune of Death itself was supposed to be locked away. The scholars who developed death sorceries were working with something dangerous and forbidden, and the spells reflect that. They are not clean or precise magic. They are magic that feels like it is doing something it probably should not. Crystallian sorceries, the magic of Livingstone. The Crystallians are enemies you encounter in caves and underground areas throughout the lands between, and they represent one of the stranger life forms in the game. They appear to be humanoid beings made entirely of crystal, attacking with crystal weapons and eventually shattering into fragments when defeated. Their relationship to glintstone and to the magic associated with it is close, but distinct. Crystallian sorceries, the spells associated with these beings and their aesthetic, tend to manifest as large crystalline projectiles or shards. The Crystal Torrent is a signature spell in this family, unleashing a stream of crystal fragments that deal physical and magic damage. The Crystal Burst spell fires a single large shard forward. These are very physically grounded magic spells compared to the more energy-projecting standard glintstone spells. They feel more material, more geological. This makes sense given what the Crystallians seem to be. They are not scholars who have studied glintstone and learned to manipulate it intellectually. They are beings who are, in some sense, made of a related material. Their magic does not project energy, it projects matter. They throw pieces of themselves or pieces of their environment as weapons. This is a fascinating variant on the glintstone tradition that suggests crystalline magic can exist in a much more embodied form than the Academy's approach would allow for. The caves where Crystallians live are often rich in mineral deposits, and there is a sense that these creatures have a symbiotic or integral relationship with the crystals around them. They do not mine or collect the crystals. They exist among them in a way that blurs the boundary between organism and environment. This makes them feel ancient in a way that the Academy's structured scholarship does not. They seem older than the institution, like remnants of a time when the relationship between intelligent beings and crystalline matter was more direct and less mediated by study. The sorceries associated with crystallians are learnable by the player, suggesting that the underlying mechanism, the crystalline projection of glintstone-adjacent energy, is something that a trained sorcerer can understand and replicate. But the visual aesthetic remains distinct. When the player casts Crystal Torrent, it does not look like a standard Academy sorcery. It looks like what a crystallian would do, which is a deliberate design choice that acknowledges the different origin of these spells. The Jarberg area of the game, which contains the strange living jar people, has some thematic adjacency to the crystallians in terms of the idea of beings whose form is their purpose. But the magic traditions are separate. The jars are associated with spirit ash and ash of war rather than sorcery. It is the crystallians, specifically, who carry this particular branch of crystalline magic forward, and they carry it not as a tradition to be learned, but as an expression of what they fundamentally are. One detail that often goes unnoticed is that the crystallians do not appear to have any social structure or hierarchy in the game. You never see a crystallian teacher, a crystallian leader, a crystallian institution. They simply exist in their caves, attacking anything that comes in, protecting their crystalline environments. If their magic has a tradition, in the sense of deliberate development and transmission, it is not one we see evidence of. It may be that crystalline sorcery is simply what happens when a being made of crystalline matter reaches a certain level of sophistication. Not learned, just expressed. Magma sorceries, fire from below. Magma sorceries occupy an interesting middle ground in terms of both element and tradition. They deal fire damage rather than magic damage in most cases, which places them closer to incantations in terms of what they do. But they are categorized as sorceries because they are channeled through staves and scale with intelligence. The mechanism, in other words, is intellectual manipulation of magical energy. The output just happens to be volcanic fire rather than starlight. The lore connection for magma sorceries is primarily to two places. The first is Mount Gelmir and Volcano Manor, and the second is the magma worms, the serpentine creatures associated with volcanic environments throughout the game. Volcano Manor is one of the most morally interesting locations in Elden Ring. It is home to Tanith and her collection of assassins, warriors, and malcontents who have all decided, for various reasons, to work against the greater will and the Erd tree. Rykard, the Lord of Blasphemy, is the demigod associated with this location. He made a choice to merge with the god-devouring serpent, an ancient being of enormous size and appetite, in a project that he apparently saw as a kind of revenge or ultimate rejection of the greater will's authority. Rykard literally became part of a serpent god, his consciousness merging with an entity ancient enough to have its own traditions and its own magic. Rykard's connection to blasphemy and to the serpent also connects him to fire, specifically the kind of volcanic, magmatic fire associated with the Earth's depths, rather than the Erd tree's divine flame. This is a meaningful distinction. The Erd tree's fire is golden, sacred, associated with order and grace. Magma fire is primordial, destructive, associated with the Earth's own heat that predates any of the Elden Ring structures. The magma worms, giant serpentine creatures that wallow in magma flows, seem to carry their own relationship to this kind of fire that predates Rykard's project. Their magic, the magma worms' scalesword weapon skill, and the various magma spells associated with them, suggests that volcanic fire magic existed long before the demigod decided to merge with a serpent. The worms may have been the original practitioners, or at least the original embodiments, of this magic tradition. Magma sorceries for the player include Magma Shot, which fires a blob of magma forward, Roiling Magma, which lands and then erupts after a delay, and the spectacular Gelmir's Fury, which calls a gout of magma from the earth around the caster. They also include Rykard's Rancor, which invokes the specific magic of the Lord of Blasphemy himself, sending a stream of skull-shaped magma projectiles at a target. That last one is the most explicitly tied to a specific individual rather than a general tradition. The use of intelligence to channel magma magic is curious and worth thinking about. It implies that the volcanic fire, while elemental and primordial feeling, is not just a natural force being tapped in an incantation-style devotional way. It is a force being analysed and manipulated through intellect. Someone at some point looked at the magma and figured out how to work with it in a way that was fundamentally scholarly. That someone may have been a practitioner at the ancient crater formation that Mount Gelmir represents, studying the volcanic activity the same way Academy scholars studied glintstone. The connection between Rykard and the volcano manor also adds a layer of taboo to these sorceries. In using magma spells, you are working within a tradition associated with a demigod who rejected the Erd Tree and chose a path that the Golden Order would certainly consider heretical. That does not make the magic evil in the game's framework, since the game is fairly careful to avoid simple moral frameworks for magic. But it does carry an implication. These are not Academy-approved spells. These are the sorceries of someone who decided to go outside the sanctioned systems and find power elsewhere. Primeval sorceries, the magic before the Academy. Primeval sorceries are some of the most powerful and most visually spectacular spells in the game, and they represent a specific historical claim. The primeval current, as the game calls it, is described as an ancient sorcery tradition that predates the formalization of the Academy, and that the Academy itself later suppressed, or at least refused to officially sanction. The Glintstone Dragon, Smaragd and Glintstone Dragon Adula, the two major dragon sorcerers in the game, are associated with an ancient era when dragons ruled the lands between, and when their own traditions of starlight and storm magic were the dominant forms of power. The primeval current seems connected to that era, a magic that is rawer and more directly tied to the fundamental energies of the cosmos rather than the organized application of those energies that the Academy developed. Comet Azure is the most famous primeval sorcery and one of the most memorable spells in any video game released in recent years. It is a sustained beam of pure comet energy that, when held, simply annihilates everything in front of the caster for as long as the focus lasts. The description of Comet Azure links it to Azure, one of the two legendary sorcerers who founded or shaped the primeval current tradition. Azure apparently sought the primeval current by chasing a falling comet to its landing site, finding there a tremendous concentration of the energy and developing the sorcery from that direct encounter. Stars of Ruin is another primeval sorcery, one that sends 12 successive magical projectiles raining down on a target area. The description links it to Lusa, the other legendary sorcerer associated with this tradition. Lusa apparently went even further in his pursuit of the primeval current, to the point where his very body was consumed by it. You find him in the Celia hideaway cave, his form preserved but suffused with glintstone energy to a degree that is clearly not natural. He sits surrounded by enormous crystals, looking like a being on the edge of dissolution into pure magic. Both Azure and Lusat were once affiliated with Raya Lucaria. The Academy's relationship to primeval sorceries is therefore a story of internal rupture. These were not outsiders who developed a competing tradition. They were Academy sorcerers who went so far in a particular direction that the institution either expelled them or they left of their own accord. The primeval current represents what happens when academic scholarship pushes past the boundaries of what the institution is willing to accept. When the drive to understand the fundamental nature of magic overrides concern for personal safety or institutional propriety. The spells in this category, Comet Azure, Stars of Ruin, Meteorite, Eternal Darkness, Founding Rain of Stars, are all spectacular in their effects and in their descriptions. They feel like the product of someone who has gone all the way to the edge of what glintstone magic can do, and then kept going. The Founding Rain of Stars in particular, with its invocation of the rains of stars that supposedly shaped the primeval era, suggests a sorcery that is trying to replicate or invoke a cosmological event. Not just manipulating starlight energy, but calling down a rain of the stars themselves. Founding Rain of Stars is found in a location that connects it to the original era, and its description says it recreates the meteor shower that struck the lands between in primeval times, implying that glintstone itself, the crystallized starlight that all sorceries built on, was deposited through this kind of event. If that is right, then primeval sorceries are not just powerful, they are historically accurate. They are doing what the first starfall did, laying down a rain of crystallized cosmic energy. The Academy formalized the aftermath. The primeval current is trying to replicate the event itself. Oracle Bubbles and Aberrant Sorceries, the edges of the map. Oracle Bubbles is one of the stranger spells in the game's sorcery catalogue. It fires a series of large iridescent bubbles that drift forward slowly and explode on contact. It is not particularly powerful in standard gameplay contexts, but its description connects it to a deeply interesting source. The spell is associated with the Finger Ruins, the ancient ruin sites connected to the two fingers and their primordial origin. The bubbles are described as oracular, suggesting they carry some form of divinatory or prophetic quality rather than just being projectile magic. This is a very different framing from glintstone spells, which are generally described in terms of energy and force. Oracle Bubbles implies magic that communicates something, that carries meaning as well as damage. The fingers, both the two fingers, who served as the messengers of the greater will, and the three fingers, associated with the frenzied flame, are deeply alien entities whose nature is never fully explained. Their ruin sites, the finger ruins of Rhea and Mohg's hidden area, feel older and stranger than most other locations in the game. The magic associated with them, Oracle Bubbles being the most direct example, has that same quality. It does not fit neatly into the glintstone framework or the incantation framework. The Aberrant Sorceries category, which includes Oracle Bubbles and a small number of related spells, occupies this edge space. They are technically sorceries in terms of catalyst and scaling, but their thematic content is closer to the divine or alien than to the scholarly. Someone who studies them from a purely intellectual standpoint is engaging with material that may not be fully understandable through intellect alone. The Albinaurics, who have connections to the Finger Ruins and to the Haligtree, carry some association with this kind of magic in their design and in their role in the world. The first-generation Albinaurics, the slug-like beings who are actually the original form of this created race, seem connected to something older and stranger than the Erdtree's tradition. The Oracle Bubble spell has a piece of magic that drifts and pops in a way that feels almost biological rather than energetic, fits oddly well with these associations. There is also a broader point here about what these edge case sorceries tell us about the nature of intelligence as a stat in the game. Intelligence, as we said, represents the scholarly, analytical approach to magic, but the Aberrant Sorceries suggest that not everything accessible through intellectual engagement is comfortable or explicable. The human mind can reach toward the alien, it can engage with forces it does not fully understand, and the magic that comes from that engagement is neither purely scholarly nor purely devotional. It is something in between, something that intelligence can touch but not fully grasp. Golden Order incantations, the Erdtree's official magic, We are now moving into the incantation traditions, and we begin with the most politically dominant one in the game's present. Golden Order incantations are the official magic of the Erd Tree's religious system. They are what the Two Fingers would teach, what the Finger Readers would practice, what the Knights of the Erd Tree would employ in service of the Greater Will's agenda. They represent faith as a form of power, specifically faith in the Elden Ring as an absolute law and in the Erd Tree as its expression. The visual language of Golden Order incantations is golden light. They glow with the same warm, amber gold colour as the Erd Tree itself, and as the grace that guides the tarnished through the world. Spells like Erd Tree Heal, Golden Vow, and Barriers of Gold are protective and supportive magic that reflects the Order's stated purpose of maintaining stability and grace in the lands between. The combat-oriented Golden Order spells, like Radagon's Rings of Light or Litany of Proper Death, project this golden energy as weapons against those who threaten the Order. The Litany of Proper Death is particularly interesting in the context of death sorceries we discussed earlier. It inflicts what the description calls proper death on undead entities, which means it restores the finality that the Erd Tree system was supposed to provide. In a world where the rune of death was removed and the normal cycling of souls was disrupted, proper death became a weapon. The Golden Order sorceries related to it are essentially the Order's tool for policing the boundary between living and dead that its own system depends on. Golden Order fundamentalism, which is the specific ideological branch of the Erd Tree religion associated with Goldmask and Corin, takes the incantations in a more intellectual direction. Goldmask was apparently working on a theological synthesis that would reconcile the Golden Order with a purer, more abstract understanding of the Elden Ring as a law rather than as a mystery. His incantations, the law of causality and law of regression, reflect this. They are not appeals to a personal God, but applications of universal principles. The law of causality, which deals damage after the caster has been struck enough times, frames revenge or response as a logical consequence of action rather than a divine judgment. The law of regression reverses transformations and illusions, stripping away falseness in the name of a kind of truth-seeking that fits Goldmask's fundamentalist theology. The Golden Order incantations are available through Corin the Priest, who begins the game at the Round Table Hold and can be found following Goldmask in the Altus Plateau area. Their questline is one of the more philosophically interesting ones in the game, tracing what happens when absolute faith meets absolute reason and what the combination produces. The endings they point toward are not necessarily positive, which is the game's way of suggesting that even the most sincere and rigorous approaches to faith and reason can lead somewhere unintended when the fundamental structure they are operating within is already broken. The Elden Stars incantation is the most cosmologically ambitious spell in the Golden Order tradition. It calls down the very stuff of the Elden Ring in the form of a stream of golden stars that descend on everything in the area. The description links it to the origin of life in the lands between, suggesting that the Elden Stars were present at a moment of creation, that the grace and order of the Golden Order traces back to a Starfall event, not unlike the one that deposited Glintstone, but in service of a different purpose. This connection between the Golden Order and the stars is easy to miss in the middle of the game's broader lore, but it suggests that the divide between sorcery and incantation may be narrower at the foundations than it appears on the surface. Both traditions reach back toward the stars. They just do so from different philosophical positions. Crucible incantations, the Erd Tree's ancient form. Crucible incantations represent one of the most fascinating pieces of lore in the entire game, because they are fundamentally about what the Erd Tree used to be before it became the Golden Order's symbol of purity and divinely ordered grace. The Crucible is described in item descriptions and environmental storytelling as the primordial state of the Erd Tree, or more precisely, as the primordial state of life itself, as it was organized under whatever the Erd Tree's earliest form was. In this state, life was not ordered and separated into distinct species. It was a churning, intermingled mass of biological potential where different life forms overlapped and mixed freely. The crucible incantations, the aspects of the crucible, as the spells are called, allow the caster to manifest features of this primordial state, to grow a tail, to breathe fire with primordial dragon aspect, to generate a spray of thorns from the body, to launch a massive stomp with a foot that grows briefly to enormous size. These are not metaphorical expressions of ancient power. They are literal manifestations of the crucible state, the caster momentarily accessing the biological plasticity of that primordial form and expressing it through their body. This is incantation magic at its most physical and most visceral. The Crucible Knights, who serve as early and mid-game boss enemies in several locations, are described as the original knights of the Erd Tree, who served in its earliest days, when the Crucible form was still the norm. They are wearing armor that incorporates both their knightly gear and features of Crucible life, a tail, a wing, golden scale patterns that suggest draconic or reptilian ancestry within their line. They are living links to the time when the Erd Tree's power manifested differently, when life under its influence was richer and stranger. The fact that these incantations are still functional in the game's present is significant. The Golden Order has spent an enormous amount of effort trying to position itself as the final and correct form of the Erd Tree's power, the culmination of a process that started in the Crucible and progressed towards something more refined and pure. The continued existence and usability of Crucible incantations is a quiet challenge to that narrative. The older way is still there. It still works. It was not purified away. It was just set aside. There is also a reading of the Crucible that connects it to the broader theme of the Erd Tree's relationship with dragons. The Erd Tree and the dragons exist in a kind of ancient enmity in the game's lore, the Erd Tree expanding its domain and the dragons defending theirs. But the Crucible state suggests that before that enmity hardened, the dividing line between Erd Tree life and dragon life may have been much blurrier. The aspects of the Crucible include dragon-like features, fire breath, tails, wings. The people of the Crucible era were not cleanly separated from the draconic world. They were part of the same biological continuum. Aspects of the Crucible. Tail is probably the most mechanically and visually distinctive of these spells in terms of demonstrating the concept. Growing a massive tail and sweeping it across an area is not something that fits into any conventional understanding of what a human-scale fighter should be capable of. It is a reminder that the baseline of what a person could be in the time of the Crucible was much more fluid and much more startling than what the ordered world of the Golden Order would accept. Dragon Communion. Incantations eating the power of dragons. Dragon Communion incantations are built on one of the most visceral premises in the game. To access them, you need to bring a dragon heart to the Church of Dragon Communion or to the altar in the Cathedral of Dragon Communion, and you exchange that heart for the ability to use a draconic spell. You are eating the power of the dragon. You are consuming the heart, taking the essence of what that dragon was and making it part of yourself. This is not a metaphor in the Elden Ring framework. Item descriptions for Dragon Communion incantations describe the practitioner taking on aspects of the dragon whose power they have absorbed. The Exix's Decay spell, for example, invokes the specific power of Exikis the Decaying Dragon, a dragon who has been affected by the Scarlet Rot. If you have eaten Exikis' heart, you can breathe Scarlet Rot the way Exikis did. The spell is a direct inheritance. The Dragon Lord Placidusax's ruin is the apex of this tradition, tied to the legendary dragon who served as the Elden Lord before the Greater Will even brought Marika into the picture. Placidusax is one of the most ancient entities in the game, a multi-headed dragon of a scale that dwarfs other dragons, locked in a temporal stasis in the arena at the top of crumbling Farum Azula. The incantation that invokes his power calls down golden lightning in a pattern that reflects the enormity of what he was. Using it is not just a gameplay choice, it is a lore statement. You are wielding the power of the Elden Lord who predated the current order. The Dragon Communion aesthetic spans multiple elemental types: the basic Dragon Breath spells, Dragon Fire, Dragonese, Dragon Claw, deal with the most direct manifestations of draconic power. The Rot Breath and the Lightning Breath reflect specific dragon individuals who had particular affinities. The more abstract spells, Rotten Breath, Scarlet Aeonia, Exix's Decay, invoke the corrupted version of draconic power, the dragons who have been affected by the Scarlet Rot or by other forces beyond their control. The Farum Azula connection is important here. Crumbling Farum Azula is a city suspended in a storm, remnants of an architecture that clearly predates the Erdtree's dominance. The Dragon Knights who served Placidusax had their own civilization there, and the echoes of their tradition persist in the eternal city's crumbling towers, and the Beastmen who now guard them. The Beastmen of Farum Azula, the draconic tree sentinels, the ancient dragon Lancersax, all of these are remnants of a world that existed before the current order and that had its own relationship to draconic power. One reading of Dragon Communion incantations that feels supported by the lore is that this tradition is not just about taking dragon power, but about acknowledging a continuity between human life and draconic life. The Crucible, as we discussed, suggests that the dividing line was always blurrier than the Golden Order would prefer to admit. Dragon Communion takes that blurriness and makes it active. By eating a dragon heart, the practitioner is not just gaining access to a power, the ethics of using magic to create life. The first-generation Albinaurics, the slug-like forms you encounter in specific areas, are the original form of this created people. They were made using the Academy's techniques, a collaboration between glintstone scholarship and something closer to life creation magic. The second-generation Albinaurics, who look more humanoid and who you encounter in larger numbers, were made differently, possibly with Miquella's involvement given their eventual connection to the Haligtree and to the unalloyed gold. The Albinaurics are described in-game as a people who have no guidance from grace, no ability to see the gold threads that guide others through the world. This exclusion from the Erdtree's attention is the fundamental fact of their existence. They were made, but they were not made to be included. The Academy, or whoever created them, was interested in the technical problem of life creation, the social and ethical dimensions of creating a people who would have desires, fears, relationships, and would ultimately die without any of the supportive structures that ordinary humans took for granted. This seems to have been less carefully considered. The magical question embedded in the Albinauric creation is whether using glintstone sorcery to create life produces something genuinely alive or something that mimics life. The game suggests the former through the very humane portrayal of individual Albinaurics. Albus, the old Albinauric who gives you the medallion early in the game, is a person. He has history, he has grief, he has something precious to protect, and someone he trusts to protect it. He is not a construct. He is a person made in an unusual way. The tragedy of the Albinauric situation is that the magic which created them, for all its sophistication, did not come with any sense of responsibility toward the created. This is a pattern in how the game portrays scholarship. The Academy could do extraordinary things. It could systematize the energy of the cosmos into teachable curriculum. It could create life with glintstone techniques. What it apparently could not do, or chose not to do, was take seriously the downstream consequences of its creations. The Albinaurics were made and then left to navigate a world that had not been designed with them in mind. Ashes of War as Distributed Magic. We would be doing this topic a disservice if we did not address Ashes of War, because they represent a form of magic distribution that is quite different from the sorcery and incantation traditions. They are weapon skills, but many of them carry genuine magical effects tied to specific traditions, and they represent the way that magic has been made accessible to non-specialist fighters throughout the Lands Between's history. Sacred Order, which applies the Golden Order's faith-adjacent buff to a weapon, is an Ash of War. Bloodhound Step, which uses a form of spatial movement that echoes Night Sorcery's concealment tradition, is an Ash of War. Hoarfrost Stomp, before it was adjusted in patches, was one of the most powerful frost application tools in the game and represents the application of freezing magic to combat in a broadly accessible format. These are not spells that require investment in intelligence or faith. They are techniques encoded into the way a weapon is used, available to anyone who finds the appropriate whetstone knife and the relevant ash. The Ash of War distribution system, through the Nomadic Warrior's Cookbook and the various scarabs and birds that drop them throughout the world, suggests a tradition of magical technique being embedded in martial craft and spread through non-institutional channels. Where the Academy teaches sorcery in a curriculum, and the Golden Order's priests teach incantations through religious hierarchy, Ashes of War seem to have developed through a more distributed process. Individual fighters discovered techniques, encoded them, and those encodings spread through adventurers and mercenaries and wanderers rather than through formal institutions. Knight Bernal, who you encounter at the Volcano Manor, is a figure who embodies this martial magical tradition. He is a knight who uses the blasphemous claw and other items associated with the Elden Ring's more dangerous aspects. A person whose combat style integrates magical technique in a way that does not require him to be a sorcerer or a priest. He is just a fighter who has learned to use the encoded power of certain traditions without necessarily subscribing to their underlying theology. This accessible version of magic, the Ash of War tradition, is in some ways the most democratic form of magical practice in the Lands Between. It does not ask for intelligence investment or faith investment. It asks for skill and for having found the right technique. In a world where access to magic was otherwise tightly controlled by institutions and bloodlines, Ashes of War represent a kind of magical commons, a collection of techniques that float free of their original traditions and become available to whoever encounters them. Spirit Ashes and the magic of the dead made useful. The Spirit Ash system is another form of magic that deserves attention in a comprehensive survey because it represents a tradition of magic that is not quite sorcery and not quite incantation, but something with its own character entirely. Spirit Ashes are the residual forms of beings who have died, captured in ash form, and preservable in a way that allows them to be summoned back to briefly re-inhabit the world. The Jellyfish Spirit Ashes, the Wolves, the Lone Wolf Ashes, the Black Knife Tiche, the Mimic Tear, the Lutel, the Headless. All of these are captured spirits of beings who lived and died in the Lands Between. What magic captures them in the ash form is not fully explained. Any other finger reader can strengthen these spirits by spending the resources associated with the Erd Tree, which implies the Erd Tree system has some role in the Spirit Ash economy. But the summoning itself, the act of calling a spirit back for brief re-presence in the world, uses a bell associated with a tradition that feels older and more specific than the Erd Tree's general management of the dead. Melina, who you encounter as the game's guide figure, and who has her own connection to the Erd Tree that is ultimately mysterious, provides the spirit calling bell as one of her first gifts to the Tarnished. The choice to give the player this tool early and prominently suggests that the game considers spirit summoning a fundamental part of the Tarnished's toolkit and a fundamental part of the world's magical ecology. The Mimic Tear is the most lore-significant spirit ash in the game. It is a being made of tears of the Erd tree, the same liquid grace that flows through the Erd tree's fundamental nature, shaped into a form that mimics whatever is closest to it. When you summon it, it becomes a copy of you. The implications of this are profound. It means that the Erd tree's tears, the grace it produces, are so full of the potential for form that given the right circumstances, they will simply become whatever they are exposed to. The Mimic Tear in Notechron, before it was captured in ash form, was clearly causing significant problems for whatever existed in that underground city. The Spirit Ash tradition also raises the question of consent. The spirits in these ashes were once living beings. Did they agree to be captured in this form? Do they experience the brief summoning moments as something? The game does not answer this, but it does give some spirit ashes specific flavour through their combat behaviour and their descriptions. Black Knife Teach, the spirit ash of one of the assassins who participated in the Night of the Black Knives, moves and fights with the specific techniques associated with that tradition. The spirit retains the skill it had in life. Whatever it experienced between its death and its summoning, it kept its craft. The 2 fingers and 3 fingers as magical entities. We have referenced the 2 fingers and 3 fingers throughout this video, but they have not been addressed as magical entities in their own right, and they deserve that attention because they are among the strangest and most significant beings in the entire game. The 2 fingers serve as the communication channel between the greater will, the cosmic entity whose agenda shaped the Elden Ring and the Golden Order, and the mortal world of the lands between. They are present in the Round Table Hold, enormous, semi-organic looking appendages resting on a carved pedestal, attended by the finger reader, Ania, who can interpret their messages. They cannot speak in any language the characters in the game use. They communicate through means that the finger readers translate. Their actual nature, whether they are beings or appendages of a being or something else entirely, is deliberately obscure. The magic associated with the 2 fingers is not any specific spell category. It is more ambient, more structural. The guidance of grace, the golden threads that the tarnished and others can perceive, comes from the greater will through the 2 fingers. The Elden Ring itself, the fundamental law of reality, was made through the greater will's influence, with the 2 fingers as the channel. When the fingers are broken or damaged, as they are in the Round Table Hold, the transmission of guidance becomes garbled. The grace remains, but the direction it points becomes less clear. This is a central tension in the game's plot. The 2 fingers are giving the tarnished a specific directive: restore the Elden Ring and become Elden Lord. But the 2 fingers themselves are damaged. Their message may not be accurate. The greater will's original intention, if it ever had a clear one, has been filtered through entities whose capacity to transmit it faithfully is compromised. The entire Golden Order ending, the most apparently conventional ending in the game, is built on instructions delivered through a broken telephone. The 3 fingers are a different and more alien entity entirely. They are found deep underground, in a location accessible only by stripping away all equipment and descending a lift shaft that feels like descending into the Earth's core. Their physical appearance is cruder than the 2 fingers, more overtly disturbing, and their communication is not mediated through any finger reader tradition. They burn their message directly into the bearer. There is no translation, there is no subtlety, there is just the mark and what it means. The 3 fingers are described as the Formless Mother's physical manifestation in some readings, though this overlaps with the 3 fingers association with the Fell God and the Frenzied Flame in ways that are not fully reconciled. They represent something the greater will and the 2 fingers genuinely fear, something that the entire structure of the Erd Tree and the Golden Order was partially designed to keep contained. The fact that they still exist, still wait at the bottom of the world, still transmit their message to anyone desperate enough to go all the way down, is a quiet suggestion that the containment has never been complete. Bloodflame incantations and the Lord of Blood. Mog the Lord of Blood is one of the hidden demigods of the game, accessible through a secret passage in the Mogwin Dynasty Mausoleum after teleporting through a specific location in the consecrated snowfield or being sent there by White Mask Vara's questline. He is one of the most disturbing figures in the game's cast because his desire and his power are so visually and conceptually excessive. Mohg's magic, the Bloodflame tradition, is associated with the Formless Mother, an outer god who is apparently a being of blood and rot and carnal excess. The Bloodflame incantations combine blood and fire in a way that produces a scarlet burning effect quite different from either standard pyromancy or the Scarlet Rot tradition. Bloodflame Blade, Blood Boon, Bloodflame Talons, all of these invoke both the burning and the hemorrhaging, the two effects that define Mog's aesthetic. The hemorrhage status effect, which builds up through repeated hits and eventually causes a burst of physical damage, is associated not just with Mog, but with a broader tradition of blood magic in the game. Arcane Scaling, which governs hemorrhage build-up on many weapons, also governs the Mogwin's Sacred Spear's capabilities and the Bloodflame incantations. This triple connection, arcane as a stat, hemorrhage as a status, Bloodflame as an incantation school, suggests that the outer god of blood has made herself most accessible through the game's systems of concealment, luck, and hidden potential, rather than through open faith or structured study. Mohg's scheme, taking Miquella into his blood palace to cultivate a god for his dynasty, reveals the essentially predatory nature of his relationship to power. He does not receive grace, he does not study the cosmos, he finds things of enormous potential and attempts to possess them. His Bloodflame magic, in this context, is the tool of a captor, a magic of overwhelming and consuming rather than partnering with. The blood that burns through his incantations is not offered freely, it is taken. White Mask Vara, the first NPC you encounter in the game, who then reappears in a questline of increasing moral complexity, is a follower of Mohg who can bring the player into contact with the Mogwin blood tradition. The questline involves invading other players' worlds and dipping cloth in their blood, an initiation ritual that explicitly frames the tradition in terms of violation and sacrifice. It is one of the more intentionally uncomfortable questlines in the game, and the questline's discomfort is appropriate. The magic of the Lord of Blood is not supposed to feel okay. Frost and cold magic, the preserving quality of ice. Frost and cold damage in Elden Ring are not tied to a single specific incantation or sorcery tradition in the same way that, say, Bloodflame is tied to Mohg. Instead, they appear across multiple traditions as a secondary property, which is interesting in itself. Cold is not a magic school with its own cosmological origin story. It is a quality that several different traditions have found ways to incorporate. The most famous use of frost magic is probably the Hoarfrost Stomp, an ash of war that was extraordinarily powerful at launch. But the sorcery tradition that most explicitly incorporates cold is the Carian tradition, specifically through the Freezing Mist and related spells, and through the Dark Moon affinity on weapons. The Carian connection to the moon includes the moon's qualities of coldness and distance, and those qualities translate into the frost buildup that characterizes moon-affiliated weapons and spells. The Frozen Needle Rapier, the Ghost Flame Dragon's attack patterns, the Astal encounters with their spatial cold, all of these bring frost into contact with traditions that are not primarily about cold, but have cold as an aspect. The Ghost Flame, as we discussed, is the cold fire of improperly contained death. Astal is a being from the outer void, and the void is cold in a very literal cosmological sense. The Carian moon is cold with the distance of the night sky. This distributes frost across multiple traditions in a way that makes it feel like a property of the world rather than a specific magic system. Things that come from very far away or from very deep in the ground or from the edge of what is alive tend to be cold. Cold is what happens when ordinary heat and warmth have drained away from something, when it has been separated from the living warmth of the world for long enough that even its magical nature has cooled. Crucible Knight Siluria, a boss in the Deeproot Depths, uses frost in combination with crucible magic in a way that is unusual and suggests that even the primordial Crucible era had cold aspects. The Crucible, as we described it, was a churning biological mix. But biology does not automatically mean warm. The deepest and most ancient things in the lands between, the things that predate the Erd Tree's ordering influence, seem to have this cold quality, as if the original state of the world was colder and the Erd Tree's golden warmth was something added later. Poison and toxin as incantation. Adjacent magic poison in Elden Ring occupies a similar position to frost. It is not a single tradition with a single origin story. It is a property that appears across multiple magical and non-magical contexts. The venomous fang weapons, the poison mist incantation, the swamp of Aeonia's inherent toxicity, the kindred of rot enemies in the shaded castle, the volcano cave's poisonous environment. All of these represent different sources of the same basic affliction. The scarlet rot and poison are related but distinct. Poison kills gradually. Scarlet rot is more aggressive and has the additional cosmological freight of being tied to an outer god. Poison seems more like a natural property of specific environments and organisms rather than a transmitted divine affliction. The kindred of rot, which look like humanoids with insect features and rot-adjacent aesthetics, are associated with a kind of organic corruption that is not quite the scarlet rot but that overlaps with it visually and thematically. The mushroom armor set describes its wearers as people who have made peace with poison by taking it into themselves in controlled doses, gradually building immunity through exposure. This is not magic in the technical sense, but it reflects the same kind of logic that governs several of the actual magic traditions. The idea that contact with a dangerous force, maintained at a survivable level, can eventually transform the practitioner in useful ways. The poison mist incantation is one of the older feeling spells in the game, associated with dragon communication in a way that suggests some of the more elemental dragons were connected to poisonous environments as well as to volcanic or rotting ones. Poison Swamp Dragon. Elsire, a boss in Aeonia Swamp, exists in an environment so saturated with rotten poison that the two have become indistinguishable in that location. The magic that flows from environments like that reflects the same saturation. The sealed runes and their relationship to spells. Design. One thing that does not get enough attention in discussions of Elden Ring magic is the role of the Elden Ring's runes themselves as a template for spell design. The Elden Ring, before its shattering, contained specific runes that encoded specific laws of reality. The Rune of Death, which we have discussed extensively. The Rune of Protection, connected to Godric's attempt to graft himself more power. The Rune of the Unborn, associated with Renala's Amber Egg and the rebirth mechanic. Many spells in the game seem to be attempts to access or express these runes without possessing the great runes themselves. The death sorceries, as we discussed, tap into the Rune of Death's energy through the Death Root and Ghost Flame phenomena. The Erd Tree Heal family accesses something like the Rune of Protection's principle, the law that grace should sustain the living. The Renala questline's rebirth mechanic is the Rune of the Unborn expressed through the Amber Egg. This means that many spell categories are not just traditions with historical origins. They are also reflections of the actual laws that the Elden Ring encoded. When a sorcerer throws a death sorcery, they are working with a fragment of one of the fundamental laws of the world. When a priest calls down Erd Tree Heal, they are accessing the principle that the Elden Ring once formally expressed. The spells are smaller, more accessible versions of laws that used to be held together in a single object. Now that the ring is shattered, the laws themselves have become diffuse, accessible in fragmented form to anyone with the right combination of attribute investment and discovered knowledge. This is perhaps the deepest way to understand why there are so many magic traditions in the game's present. They are not just competing schools of thought, they are competing access points to the shattered law of reality itself. Every tradition is touching a different piece of what the Elden Ring used to hold together, finding ways to use fragments of cosmic law for purposes both intended and wildly beyond what any version of the ring's designers would have anticipated. The churches of Marika and the spread of magic. The network of churches of Marika scattered throughout the lands between represents something interesting for magic distribution, specifically because of what they contain. Each church of Marika holds a sacred tier, which can be used to upgrade the sacred flask's healing capacity. But they also represent nodes in a network that Marika or her servants established to extend the reach of the Erdtree's influence across the entire map. This network is important for understanding how magic spread to people who are not scholars or priests by training. The churches provided access to the Erdtree's grace at geographic points far from Leindel and far from Raya Lucaria. A farmer or craftsman who needed healing magic, who needed protection from the creatures of the lands between, could visit a church and access a simplified version of the incantation tradition, even without formal training. This democratizing function of the church network is in interesting tension with the Academy's much more restricted access model. Raya Lucaria did not build its analogue of satellite institutions across the landscape. Its magic stayed within the Academy's walls and was transmitted through a formal educational process that required resources and aptitude beyond what most people possessed. The Golden Order, through its church network, spread its magic more broadly, at the cost of depth. The incantations available through churches are the basics, the foundational heals and wards, not the intricate, high-level work that the full faith investment produces. This two-tiered access to magic, broad and shallow through the church network, versus deep and exclusive through the academy system, mirrors the class structure of the lands between more broadly. The great powers, the academy, the royal houses, the Erdtree's inner circle, kept the most potent and most knowledge-intensive magic to themselves. The outer population got enough to survive, enough to fight the creatures of the night, but not enough to threaten the established hierarchy. Ranni's questline, as a tour through multiple magic traditions, Ranni the Witch's questline is, among many other things, a structured tour through several of the game's most significant magic traditions. Following her quest takes you into contact with the Carian tradition she inherited, the night sorceries connected to the Black Knife conspiracy, the gravity magic of Radan, the underground civilizations and their stargazing traditions, the alien presence of Astel, and ultimately the full moon sorcery that forms the apex of what Ranni is and what she is trying to accomplish. This is not an accident. Ranni's plan required knowledge and resources from multiple traditions precisely because she was trying to do something that no single tradition could accomplish. She needed Radan's gravity magic neutralized so the stars could move. She needed the Finger Slayer blade to deal with the Two Fingers' influence. She needed the underground city's proximity to the Eternal Ring to access the ring itself. She needed the Prince of Death's pustule as evidence of what Godwyn became. Every step of her quest draws on a different piece of the world's magical ecology. The fact that you're playing a Tarnished who can use all of these magic traditions simultaneously is not just a mechanical convenience, it is a narrative one. The Tarnished is the one entity in the world who is positioned to navigate all of these traditions without being bound by any of them. The Academy would restrict you to their curriculum. The Erdtree would expect your faith to be exclusive. The Dragon Communion requires you to eat hearts, but does not ask for your allegiance. The Frenzied Flame would ask for everything. But a tarnished who has been outside grace for long enough is not under any of these obligations. You can carry all of them. This is what makes the tarnished potentially the most magically versatile being in the game's world. Not the most powerful, not the most learned, but the most free. The player character can hold the full moon sorcery of the Carians and the black flame of the Godskins and the bestial incantations of Gurranq and the death sorceries of the Glomide Queen's tradition all at once. No institution would allow this. No faith would accept it. Only someone with nothing left to lose and no allegiance to maintain could be simultaneously fluent in all of these traditions. The remembrances and what they tell us about magic. The remembrances, the items dropped by major bosses and tradable with Enya for specific weapons or spells, represent another angle on the magic traditions we have discussed. Each remembrance encodes not just the power of the defeated being, but their specific magical identity. The remembrance of the Star Scourge, Radan's remembrance, can become his twin swords, or his gravity sorceries. The remembrance of the grafted, Godric's remembrance, becomes his axe, or the grafted dragon arm. The remembrance of Renala becomes the full moon sorcery, or her beloved full moon sword. These exchanges emphasize that the game understands the connection between specific individuals and specific magic traditions. Radan's gravity magic is so identified with him that his death releases it in a form that can be distributed as a remembrance. The magic and the person are not fully separable. Killing Radan does not just remove a powerful enemy, it makes his particular version of gravity sorcery accessible in a way it was not before, because it was always, in some sense, his. This is a very different understanding of magic from the view that spells are just techniques to be learned and applied. In the remembrance framework, the most potent magic is personal. It is the expression of who a being is, carried in their body and released at their death. The remembrances are magical autopsies. They are what you find when you cut open something enormously powerful and look at what it was made of. The Enya, the finger reader who performs this exchange, sitting in the round table hold and trading remembrances for power, is herself a fascinating figure in this context. She is a person who touches the residual presence of dead gods and demigods with apparent equanimity, extracting from those remains what can be usefully passed on. Her role is essentially that of a mortuary magician, one who processes the dead and ensures their power does not go to waste. In a world where the system for processing the dead is broken, she is performing a localized version of that function for the most significant deaths in recent history. Sorcery and incantation as two philosophies of knowledge. We have been treating the sorcery versus incantation divide as primarily a mechanical distinction throughout this video, and it is worth spending some time before we close on what it means philosophically. Because the game is clearly making a statement with this division, and it is not a statement that straightforwardly favours one side. Sorcery says, the power is in the cosmos, and access to it is a matter of understanding. Study it, systematize it, develop increasingly precise mental models of how it works, and your access to it will grow in proportion to your understanding. The cosmos is not a being with preferences. It does not care whether you believe in it. It only responds to accurate engagement. Get the model right, and the power follows. Incantations say, the power is in relationship. It flows from beings or forces that are greater than you, and your access to it depends on your connection to those beings or forces. You cannot compel it through understanding. You can only receive it through alignment. The cosmos is full of will. It is not neutral, and the magic you can access depends on which of those wills you have chosen to stand beside. Both of these are demonstrably true within the game's fiction. Sorceries work. Incantations work. The divide is real, and the two systems produce genuinely different magic with genuinely different characters. Neither tradition has a monopoly on power. Some of the most devastating spells in the game are sorceries, some are incantations, The game refuses to settle the question of which philosophy of knowledge is more correct by simply making one side stronger. What it does instead is show the costs and the failures of both approaches. The Academy pursued understanding so relentlessly that some of its members lost themselves in the process. The Golden Order pursued faith in the greater will so completely that it became a tool for the greater will's agenda, whether or not that agenda was actually good for the people of the lands between. Primeval sorcerers found the truth at the edge of the cosmos and were consumed by it. The Frenzied Flame offers a radical incantation tradition that offers its truth only by taking everything else away. The Tarnished, again, is the figure who escapes this bind, not by transcending both traditions, but by using both without being defined by either. You do not have to choose between studying and believing. You can do both. You can cast a gravity sorcery one moment and an Erd tree heal the next and a black flame after that. The philosophical coherence that every tradition demands of its practitioners is something the Tarnished is exempt from, by virtue of being the one entity in the world whose grace ran out and then came back in a way that even the two fingers cannot fully explain. The celestial seals and their lore weight. The sacred seals used to channel incantations deserve more individual attention than they often receive, because each one encodes something specific about the tradition it is most associated with. The finger seal, the most basic one, is associated with the two fingers and the Golden Order's mainstream. The Dragon Communion seal is specifically designed for those who have made covenants with dragons. The Gravelstone seal enhances ancient dragon lightning strikes. The Godslayer's seal is associated with the Godskin tradition and boosts black flame incantations. The Golden Order seal enhances the fundamentalist incantations, the spells tied to Goldmask's interpretation of the greater will. The Frenzied Flame seal, predictably, boosts the Frenzied Flame incantations. The Giant seal boosts Fire Giant-related spells. Each of these seals is a statement about which tradition the seal was developed in service of, which community of believers shaped it, which set of cosmological assumptions baked into its design. The Erdtree seal is interesting because it is the most broadly powerful for pure faith-based casting, but it does not specialize in any particular sub-tradition. This reflects the Erdtree's claimed universality. The Erdtree presents itself as the source of all grace, not just of one particular group's practice. The seal that channels that claim most directly does not favor anyone. Incantation school over another. It is the seal of the institution rather than the seal of any specific tradition within it. The split between seals and staves is more than a mechanical distinction. It is a cosmological one. Seals channel relationship magic. Staves channel analysis magic. The physical form of each reflects this. A staff is a tool of extension and projection, of reaching out from the practitioner's mind to manipulate something at a distance. A seal is a tool of invocation, of calling down or channeling through, of opening a connection between the practitioner and something that then flows through them. The postures associated with incantation casting in the game, the raised seal, the compressed energy, the release, look like prayer. The postures associated with sorcery casting look like focused mental projection, different gestures for different philosophies. The lost grace sites and magic as wayfinding. The grace sites, the glowing golden spots where the Tarnished can rest and be restored, are not just gameplay mechanics. In the game's lore, they represent the active guidance of the greater will through the Erdtree's residual power. The golden threads that lead the Tarnished towards specific sites of grace are the same gold as the Erdtree's light, the same gold as the Golden Order's incantations. This means that the Tarnished's entire navigation of the lands between is mediated by one particular tradition's magic. The golden grace that guides you is not neutral. It comes from the greater will and flows through the two fingers and the Erdtree. Every time you follow the golden thread, You are accepting the guidance of the entity whose agenda shapes the dominant magic tradition of the world. Sites of grace that have been abandoned or that lead nowhere, the broken or depleted ones, are another dimension of this. Some parts of the world are outside the reach of the Ear Tree's guidance network. The underground cities have no natural grace sites. Farum Azula has no grace in the sense of the Ear Tree's gold. These places exist outside the system, which means navigating them requires your own sense of direction rather than the prescribed path. The Frenzied Flames domain has no golden grace. The Three Fingers offer no guiding light. What they offer is total dissolution, the magic of guidance itself. The golden compass function of the Ear Tree's remaining grace is perhaps the most pervasive and least noticed magic in the entire game. It shapes where players go. It shapes what they encounter. The greater will does not have to speak directly. It guides through ambient magical infrastructure, steering the tarnish toward the outcomes it prefers through the simple fact of which sites of grace shine brightest. The wandering mausoleums and what they preserve. The walking mausoleums scattered across the lands between are one of the game's most striking environmental details. Enormous stone structures on articulated legs that carry within them the duplicates of great runes and other precious magical artifacts. They walk slowly through specific areas, and you can climb them and strike the barnacle-like growths on their exterior to stop them and access the interior. Their magic, the preservation magic that keeps the items inside fresh and accessible over what must be enormous spans of time, is not any of the traditions we have discussed. It is closer to the sealed magic we described in the context of the Saw Seals, a magic of containment and preservation rather than of projection or devotion. Someone designed these structures to walk and to carry their contents through time, ensuring that the memory of what was inside them was not lost, even as the civilization that built them collapsed. The contents of the mausoleums include the ability to copy great rune fragments and to provide access to specific magical items that would otherwise be lost. This preservation function makes the mausoleums one of the stranger magic types in the game, a tradition that exists entirely in service of preventing the loss of other traditions. It is archival magic. It is the magic of a culture that understood it might not survive, but wanted to ensure that what it knew could be found again. The Elden Ring itself, as a document of laws, was a similar kind of archival magic. The ring did not create reality. It recorded and enforced it. When it shattered, the records scattered. The mausoleums are a smaller scale version of the same impulse, walking archives in a world where the standing structures keep burning down. The larval tears and the magic of transformation. Larval tears are items used to respec at Renala, allowing the tarnish to redistribute their attribute points and completely rebuild their character. In gameplay terms, this is a quality of life feature. In lore terms, it is something much stranger and more significant. The larval tear is described as a tear of a silver tear, one of the mimicking beings that appear throughout the game. Silver tears are shape-shifting entities made of silver liquid that can take on any form, and they appear in Notecron and in various underground locations. The relationship between silver tears and larval tears suggests that the tears are connected to the transformative potential of these mimicking beings, the capacity to become something other than what you currently are. Renala's rebirth mechanic, which uses the amber egg and applies the larval tear, is therefore an intersection of her personal magic tradition, the Carian full moon sorcery centered on the amber egg, and the broader transformative magic associated with the silver tears. The result is a genuine remaking of the self that goes beyond cosmetic change. The tarnished who uses a respec has actually changed on a fundamental level, redistributed the grace and development that shaped them into a new configuration. This makes every respec a minor magic miracle, a transformation that under the game's lore conditions should probably be impossible, or at least unprecedented. The fact that Renala can do this for the Tarnished, even in her broken state, suggests that her mastery of the full moon sorcery and the amber egg is so deep that it persists past her grief, past her breakdown, past the loss of her institutional authority. The deepest magic she possesses, the ability to remake the living, is still there. The sealed tornado and Farum Azula's magic. Crumbling Farum Azula exists in a permanent storm, suspended in time above a cloud layer that has no ground beneath it, held together by temporal magic that the game describes as connected to the ancient dragon civilization's power. The tornado at the center of the environment, the one that constantly moves and reshapes the architecture around it, is not a natural meteorological event. It is a sustained magical effect of enormous scale and apparently infinite duration. The temporal magic of Farum Azula, the sense that time does not quite move normally there, is related to the ancient dragon tradition we discussed in the context of Placidusax. The dragons who lived in Farum Azula commanded forces beyond ordinary elemental magic. They worked with time, with the permanence of things, with the capacity to hold a moment in place against the flow of entropy. Placidusax's own position, locked in a temporal stasis in the arena at the top of the ruins, is the most dramatic expression of this. He has been in that moment for an incomprehensible span of time, waiting for a god who is never going to return. The beastmen of Farum Azula, who are the current inhabitants of those ruins, fight with weapons and techniques that reflect their connection to the same storm magic. Their throwing axes and chains carry lightning. Their physical power is enhanced by the eternal storm they live within. They have adapted to an environment that is itself a piece of magic, living inside the effect rather than using it as a tool. The rune arcs that you can find throughout the game are associated with the great runes and their activation, and they also carry the faintest suggestion of Farum Azula's temporal magic in their descriptions. The arcs are remnants of some ancient magical practice that predates the current understanding of runes. They are fragments of something that may have been much more coherent when the dragons were at their height, degenerated over time into small useful pieces of a once vast and integrated system. Deathblight and the status of magic in the broken world. The Deathblight status effect is the game's most extreme magical status, causing instant death when the meter fills. It is associated primarily with the death sorcery tradition and with the enemies in areas where the rune of death's energy is most concentrated. The Erdtree avatars, in later stages of the game, can apply Deathblight. The Putrid Crystallion in the Celia Crystal Tunnel area can apply it. Death Poker, a weapon found in the consecrated snowfield, builds it on hit. The fact that Deathblight exists as a condition that can be inflicted rather than just as an abstract magical force tells you something about how much the rune of death's energy has leaked into the world. When a fundamental law of reality becomes a status effect that opponents can inflict in combat, the law has become a tool rather than a principle. The death that was removed from the world by Marika, the death that was stolen by the assassins, the death that Gurranq eats to contain, has become so pervasive that it is ambient. It is in specific locations, in specific weapons, in specific magical traditions. You can catch death like you can catch rot. This is, in a very literal sense, the broken state of the world that the game asks you to repair or transform. Not just the political instability, not just the demigods' war, but the fact that the fundamental mechanisms of the world have been leaking into the environment in ways that have distorted everything. The magic systems that exist in the game's present are all adaptations to or expressions of this broken state. They are the magic of a world that has been trying to work around the absence of its fundamental law for a very long time. The various endings of the game represent different answers to this broken state. The Golden Order ending tries to restore the law approximately as it was. The Age of Stars ending, Rani's path removes the greater will's influence entirely and establishes a different kind of order. The Frenzied Flame ending dissolves the distinction between order and chaos entirely. The Age of the Duskborn ending, associated with fear and the mending rune of the Death Prince, incorporates the death that was removed, making it part of the ring again. The Age of Order ending, associated with Goldmask's work, perfects the law into something more absolute than it was before. Every ending is a proposed solution to the same magical problem, and every proposed solution has been encoded in one or more of the magic traditions we have been discussing all through this video. The player's magic and what it means. There is one more dimension of the game's magic that is worth addressing before we reach the end. The magic the player actually uses, the spells and incantations the Tarnished can access, exists in a somewhat paradoxical relationship with the lore we've been discussing. On one level, these are the tools of the various traditions, faithfully represented. When you cast Comet Azure, you are using primeval sorcery. When you cast Frenzied Burst, you are using Frenzied Flame incantations. The traditions are intact, and the spells are their products. But the player character's ability to use all of these simultaneously, to mix and match without institutional loyalty or cosmological constraint, creates a magic user who does not exist within the world's own lore. The game does not provide any character in the world who uses the full breadth of available magic. Renala is a Carian sorcerer. Malenia uses rot incantations. Radan uses gravity sorceries. Malekith uses black flame. They all have their specific tradition, and they stay in it. The Tarnished is different because the Tarnished has been outside the system. The loss of grace, the time spent dead in some sense. The return as a being who walks towards something without being claimed by anything. This is what makes the comprehensive magic use lore coherent. You are not bound by institutional affiliation. You are not bound by faith commitment. You are not bound by bloodline magic. You are a person who found all of these traditions lying around in a broken world and picked up every piece that could still be used. In this sense, the Tarnished is a kind of walking archive, like the mausoleums, carrying the remnants of every tradition that the world's collapse scattered, using them not in service of any one tradition's agenda, but in service of survival, and eventually in service of whatever ending the player chooses. The magic use is not spiritually coherent, but it is situationally accurate. This is what a person who navigated a completely broken world would look like. Someone who had to learn everything because they could not afford to know only one thing. The stars are still moving. Every time you look up at the sky in Elden Ring, if you take a moment to just look rather than fight, the stars are moving. They are not fixed in the way that Radan was keeping them fixed. After Radan's defeat, the stars are moving again. Whatever was supposed to fall has fallen or is falling. Whatever destiny was written in those celestial positions is now executing. The magic traditions we have discussed are all in some way attempts to either read that celestial script or to write over it. The glintstone sorcerers study the crystallized record of past starfalls. The primeval sorcerers chase the newest fall and try to channel it before it becomes history. The Golden Order asserts that the Greater Will's instructions, delivered through celestial means, represent the correct reading. The Frenzied Flame says the script itself should burn. Rani says the script should be rewritten in a way that the Greater Will cannot read. The Tarnished walks through all of this carrying pieces of every attempt. Looking up at the stars moving overhead, holding primeval sorcery in one hand and bestial incantations in the other. Full moon magic in a satchel somewhere, and gravity spells borrowed from a dead demigod, and death sorcery leaking in from every catacomb that has been visited. The lands between is a world that never quite decided what it was for, a world whose law was installed by an external power whose intentions were never fully transparent, whose magic systems all point toward the same sky with different gestures and different prayers. The sorcerers say, understand it. The priests say, receive it. The dragons say, they were there before any of this and the lightning was always theirs. And somewhere in that disagreement, under that moving sky, the game's magic lives, all of it, all at once. It is all still there, still in the spells, still in the world. The Wandering Academy, scholars and magic outside institutions. One of the most interesting phenomena in the world of Elden Ring is what happens to magic when it leaves its institutional home. The Academy of Raya Lucaria was, at its height, a functioning institution with rules, curricula, standards, and gatekeeping. Sorcerers graduated or did not graduate. They achieved ranks within the institution, or they did not. The magic stayed tethered to the institution by a combination of formal structure and the practical reality that glintstone in the quantities needed for high-level sorcery was most easily accessed through the Academy's supply chains and infrastructure. But the Academy's decline after Radagon's departure and Renala's breakdown changed all of this. The institution did not formally close. It did not announce that its magic was now free for anyone to use. But the practical enforcement of the Academy's exclusivity deteriorated in proportion to its organizational coherence. Scholars left, some because they had personal reasons to go, some because the institution was no longer providing what they had come for, some because they had achieved what they wanted and saw no further reason to remain, some because they were expelled for pursuing research that the remaining administration found uncomfortable. These wandering scholars carried the Academy's tradition with them as they dispersed across the lands between. You find evidence of this dispersal throughout the game. Sorcerer Rogier in Stormvale Castle is one example. He is clearly Academy trained, but is pursuing an independent research agenda. Selen, whose questline runs through multiple acts, is an Academy dropout, someone who was affiliated with the institution and then expelled, who continued her research outside its walls and built up a following of her own. Selen's specific situation is one of the most elaborate explorations of what independent magical scholarship looks like in a world where the institution still technically exists but has lost its monopoly on the tradition. She was teaching sorcery in a cellar in Limgrave, accessible through a trapdoor, continuing to practice and develop the primeval current research that got her expelled. Her students, the ones she sent you to as part of her quest, are scattered across the lands between pursuing their own extensions of the primeval current. The questline involves a choice that is genuinely difficult from a lore perspective. Selen's ambition to reunite the scattered primeval current practitioners and restore the Academy's original spirit, if not its institutional form, is presented as both admirable and dangerous. Her method, which involves the rather extreme step of transferring her consciousness into a host body and then reclaiming the Academy physically with the help of other practitioners, succeeds mechanically if you support her. But the aftermath suggests that the ambition outpaced the wisdom. The Selen you find at the end of her questline, after she has achieved her goal, is not flourishing. She has become something similar to what Lusat became, embedded in a pile of bodies, surrounded by her own crystalline growth. Achievement and destruction in the same moment. This trajectory, from brilliant independent practitioner to crystallized academic failure, is the Academy's most honest self-portrait. The institution that produced Lusat and Azur, that produced Selen, that produced scholars who went so far that they dissolved into their own research, is an institution that cannot ultimately control where its most gifted graduates go. The primeval current, once you start pulling on it, does not let go. The Wanderjarl and the Jar people's magic. The Wanderjarls, which is what you might call the jar-shaped beings you encounter at the Jarberg and elsewhere, have a relationship to magic that is easy to overlook, because they look so strange that it is tempting to think of them as comic relief. But the jars are actually meaningful magical artifacts that tell you something specific about how the Academy and related traditions understood the problem of preserving power. Jars in the lands between were used to capture spirits. This is the tradition that connects to the spirit ash system we discussed earlier. A jar could contain a spirit in a way that prevented its return to the Erd tree's recycling cycle, keeping it accessible for later use. The potboy enemies and the living jar creatures are the result of someone taking this tradition far enough to produce jars that could contain enough spirits to animate themselves, to stand up and walk around and be something like alive in their own right. Alexander, the Iron Fist warrior pot, is the most developed example of this in the game, and the one whose questline most fully explores what it means to be a living jar. He wants to fill himself with the remains of warriors, to become a vessel for accumulated fighting spirit. His journey tracks through the game's toughest fights because he is seeking to absorb the strongest possible fighting essence into himself. The logic is that a jar filled with exceptional spirit becomes something that carries those spirits' exceptional qualities. This is a form of magic that is neither sorcery nor incantation in the formal sense, but that draws on principles from both. The containment and preservation aspect is similar to the mausoleum's archival magic and to the amber egg's rebirth potential. The accumulation aspect, the idea that taking in more and more of a particular kind of power can transform you, echoes the Dragon Communion tradition and the Rykard Serpent Merging project. But jars are not doing either of these things through study or through faith. They are doing it through a kind of structural openness, a designed capacity to hold what is put into them. The Jarberg itself, the peaceful settlement of jar people in Liurnia, suggests a community that has found a way to exist outside the major power structures of the lands between by simply being too strange and too peaceful to bother. They are not affiliated with the Academy. They are not affiliated with the Golden Order. They tend their flowers, and they are visited occasionally by Dialos, the brother of the Volcano Manor questline character, Juno Hoslo, who finds in their settlements something he needed, a place where the complications of his family's violence and his own failed ambition do not follow him. The jar's magic, such as it is a magic of containment and patience. They hold things. They wait. Eventually, what they hold shapes what they become. This is not a dramatic or spectacular tradition. It is quiet and slow, but it is also, in the context of everything else happening in the lands between, remarkably stable. The nomadic merchants and their stored magic. The nomadic merchants who wander the roads and caves of the lands between are another figure that most players think of primarily as vendors rather than as lore significant. But their collections of items, including spells, incantations, and materials for both, suggest something interesting about how magical knowledge survives in a broken world. Merchants carry things with them. This is their function. But the specific things they carry include items that were presumably obtained from locations, from scholars, from traditions that no longer exist in their original forms. When you buy a sorcery from a merchant, where did they get it? The game does not always say. Sometimes the acquisition is obvious from the merchant's location. A merchant near Raya Lucaria carrying academy spells makes sense, but other times merchants carry items in ways that are harder to explain and that suggest long and complicated trade histories. The isolated merchant in the Weeping Peninsula carries items associated with traditions far outside his immediate geography. This either means that the nomadic merchant network is more sophisticated and far-reaching than it appears, or that the merchants have been travelling long enough that their collections have accumulated from sources spread across enormous geographic and temporal ranges. Both explanations are compatible with the image of beings who have been walking the roads of the lands between for a very long time, picking up what they find and carrying it with them. The abandoned merchant in the Siofra River area, underground in one of the Eternal City zones, is carrying magic items that would be extraordinary for someone to have brought underground. Either they travelled there, or others brought items to them. The underground setting raises questions about the merchant network's relationship with the surface world and about how knowledge and goods were flowing between the two in the period before the game's events. The merchants as a group are described as a cursed people, their tongues removed as punishment for something in the distant past. They communicate through written signs and through simple sounds. They are outcasts from whatever social structure existed when their curse was applied, driven to wandering by a punishment that made normal societal participation impossible. Their magic collections are, in this context, the holdings of people who had no home to store things in and no institution to validate their knowledge. They carry what they found because carrying is what they do. It is the only life available to them. This gives the merchants sold sorceries and incantations a particular quality. They are not the officially sanctioned versions that the Academy or the Golden Order would recognize. They are the versions that survived in the hands of people who were not supposed to have them, passed from practitioner to merchant to wanderer over generations until the tradition behind them was mostly forgotten, and what remained was the spell itself, stripped of its context but still functional. Magic that has outlived its school. The oracle of the death-touched and the sanctified snowfield. The consecrated snowfield is one of the game's most desolate and quietly terrible environments, a plateau of wind-blown snow where visibility drops to near zero in frequent blizzards, and where the enemies include the deathbirds in significant numbers, enormous rot eagles, and various creatures that have been pushed to the edges of the world by the forces that have reorganized everything around them. It is also the home of the Mogwin Palace portal and the Haligtree access route. This means the snowfield serves as a convergence point for three very different magical traditions: the Blood Palace and Mog's tradition of blood and chaos, the Haligtree and Michaela's tradition of compassion and unalloyed gold, and the ambient death and cold of the snowfield itself, which points toward a more ancient and more fundamental kind of power than either of the demigod traditions. The death magic that pervades the consecrated snowfield is expressed through the concentration of deathbirds and through the abundance of death-root-related enemies in the area. It is as if the rot of proper death management has pooled here in the lands between's highest and most remote region, crystallizing in the cold. The snowfield feels like the world's attic, a place where things that do not fit anywhere else have been pushed and left to settle. The specific incantations and spells you can find in this area, including some of the death sorceries and the items associated with Mog's tradition through the portal, reinforce this sense of the snowfield as a place where the edges of multiple magic traditions touch. No single tradition owns the snowfield. It is neutral ground, too cold and too remote, and too much associated with death to be claimed by any living institution. The Omen, the cursed people represented by Margit and Morgott, and the Leyndell Sewer Omen population also have a presence in this area through the scattered corpses and evidence of their passage. The Omen tradition, the power that bleeds through their horns and manifests as a kind of gravity and force magic in Morgott's case, is another magic type that lives at the margins. Omen are hidden underground, in sewers, in forbidden places, because their appearance is considered a curse, and their power is considered illegitimate by the Golden Order's standards. Morgott, whose true name and nature you learn progressively through the game, has devoted himself entirely to serving and protecting the Erdtree, even though the Erdtree system has marginalized and hidden his people for generations. His magic, the gold-tinted Omen power that he bends to service of the order that rejects him, is one of the game's most effective arguments for the complexity of faith. They are partially becoming something that the ordered world insists they are separate from. The Church of Dragon Communion is in an interesting location in the game, accessible from the earliest area of Limgrave, suggesting that this practice is ancient enough to have established its own sacred sites across the lands between before the Golden Order was dominant enough to suppress or regulate it. The fact that these churches still stand, still function, is another quiet indication that the Order's authority was never as complete as its proponents claimed. Ancient dragon lightning incantations, the storm before history. Ancient dragon lightning incantations are distinct from standard dragon communion spells and from the draconic incantations associated with regular dragon hearts. They tap specifically into the power of the ancient dragons, the ones associated with Farum Azula and with the era before the current one, and their element is lightning rather than fire or rot. The connection between ancient dragons and lightning is well established in the game's visual design. When you fight the Dragon Lord Placidusax, he attacks with golden lightning of enormous scale. The ancient dragon Lanciax, the dragon whose ghost you can encounter in the Altus Plateau, brings lightning down in a cross pattern from the sky. Lightning is the ancient dragon's element, the way that rot is associated with the scarlet rotted, and fire is associated with the Crucible era creatures. Ancient dragon's lightning strike, Lanciax's glaive, Placidusax's ruin. All of these are at the high end of the incantation damage hierarchy. They represent accessing one of the oldest and most powerful magical traditions in the entire game, one that predates not just the Golden Order, but the Elden Ring as we know it. Placidusax served an Elden Lord before Marika's era, which means his power is from a cosmological configuration we know almost nothing about. The Elder Dragon Grail, the enormous passive dragon who appears early in Caelid and whose 5 children guard her, is another link to this ancient era. Grail is so old and so large that she barely moves, existing as a kind of living geological feature more than an active creature. Her children, including Exikes the Rot Dragon, fight to protect her. The dynamic suggests a creature who has passed beyond active concern for most of what happens around her and into a kind of geological patience. The lightning associated with the ancient dragon tradition that she represents is part of an older world than the one the player is navigating. The scaling on these incantations with both faith and arcane is interesting mechanically and also lore-suggestive. Arcane in Elden Ring is associated with discovery, with the hidden, with luck in a cosmic sense. Faith is devotion. The combination suggests that accessing ancient dragon lightning requires both a willingness to give yourself over to something greater and a capacity to perceive and locate power that is not obvious or sanctioned. You cannot just have faith in the ordered world. You have to have faith in something older, and you have to be capable of finding it. Bestial incantations. The guardian at the end of the world. Bestial incantations are associated with Gurranq, the beast clergyman, one of the more memorable and tragic figures in the game's supporting cast. Gurranq sits in the bestial sanctum at the far northeastern corner of the Lands Between, deep in Dragonbarrow, accessible only through a portal from the Third Church of Marika. He is enormous, a beastman of a scale that dwarfs ordinary human figures, and he sits in a vast temple clearly built for beings of his size and nature. When you bring him Deathroot, the physical manifestation of the death energy leaking back into the world, through the Deathroot phenomenon, he eats it, and then he teaches you incantations. This is the trade, Deathroot for knowledge. The more Deathroot you bring, the more powerful the incantations he gives you, and the more agitated and unstable he becomes. At a certain threshold, he attacks you, apparently overwhelmed by what he has been consuming. The bestial incantations are interesting in their physical character. Like crystalline sorceries, but through the incantation framework, they are embodied magic. Stone of Gurranq, the basic bestial spell, has the caster hurl a sharp stone. Beast Claw is a swipe of clawed force. Bestial Sling throws a spray of jagged rocks. These are the magic of a being who is immensely physical, who expresses power through its body rather than through projection of energy. The spells scale with faith, but also with strength. which is unusual and tells you something about what kind of practitioner this tradition envisions. Who or what is Gurranq? The game suggests very strongly that Gurranq is Malekith before he has consumed enough Deathroot to remember who he is. Malekith is Marika's shadow, the guardian of the Rune of Death, the being who defeated the Gloam-eyed Queen and now carries the burden of containing the Death Rune within himself. In his Malekith form, which you eventually fight in Farum Azula, he is armoured, powerful, and clearly a different entity from the awkward, tormented Gurranq you have been feeding Deathroot to through the early and mid-game. The bestial incantations in this reading are Malekith's own tradition. They are the magic of a being who predates the Erdtree's organisation of power, who was not made by the system, but exists alongside it in a specific assigned role. The beastmen of Farum Azula, who are clearly related to what Gurranq is, had their own civilization and their own magic before the Erdtree's dominance. Bestial incantations are a remnant of that tradition. The bestial sanctum itself, that vast building at the edge of the world, has the proportions of a space designed for a different scale of being than humans occupy. It was built for someone like Gurranq, or for many beings like him. The fact that it now stands largely empty, with only Gurranq and some wandering beastmen inside, suggests that this tradition once had more practitioners and more social context than it now possesses. The bestial tradition, like so many things in the game, has contracted to a remnant, one person carrying a practice that was once shared by many. The Deathroot as payment for incantations is such a specific and unexpected detail that it deserves additional thought. Malekith, as the guardian of the Rune of Death, presumably has an obligation to contain or eliminate Deathroot whenever it appears. By eating it, Gurranq is doing that job, absorbing the death energy and neutralizing it. The teaching of incantations may be less a deliberate educational choice and more an accidental byproduct of what happens when Malekith processes that energy. The knowledge leaks out of him in the form of spells, a strange and somewhat sad image. Frenzied flame incantations, the end of all things. The frenzied flame is one of the most significant forces in Elden Ring's cosmology because it represents something fundamentally different from everything else we have discussed. All the other magic traditions, whether they serve the Golden Order or oppose it, exist within the framework of a world that is meant to continue existing. They are tools for people who have stakes in the ongoing life of the lands between, even if they disagree violently about how that life should be organised. The frenzied flame is not interested in any version of continuation. It is the force of absolute dissolution, the end of all distinction and all boundary, the merging of everything into an undifferentiated state. The three fingers are the counterpart to the two fingers. Where the two fingers transmit the guidance of the greater will, a cosmic entity concerned with order and continuation, the three fingers transmit the will of something the game calls the Fell God, associated with a kind of chaotic frenzy that desires the burning of everything. The frenzied flame incantations are what happens when someone accepts that message and learns to channel it. Vike's Dragon Bolt, Surge O Flame, Unendurable Frenzy, Frenzied Burst, Howl of Shabriri. These spells have a quality of uncontrolled release about them that distinguishes them from almost every other incantation type. Golden Order incantations have dignity and structure. Dragon Communion spells have ancient weight. Frenzied Flame incantations have urgency and heat, and a suggestion of madness barely contained. Shabriri is the figure most associated with spreading the frenzied flame in the game's present. He appears possessing Yura's body after Yura's death, and actively advocates for the Tarnished to embrace the flame. His argument is essentially that the world is so irreparably broken that the only honest response to it is to let it all go. The Greater Will's project has failed. The Elden Ring is shattered. The Erdtree is corrupted. The demigods are at war. In Shabriri's framing, the frenzied flame is not evil. It is a release from a situation that has become untenable. Hieta the Finger Maiden, who appears at various sites of grace throughout Liurnia and the Altus Plateau, is a much gentler embodiment of the same tradition. She is blind or nearly so, and is slowly losing her sight to something that is burning it away. She eats shabriri grapes, the eyes of shabriri and others who have given themselves to the three fingers, in pursuit of what she believes is a form of grace. Her path is the path toward becoming the frenzied flame's vessel, and it is rendered not as horror, but as tragedy. She is not corrupt or evil. She is seeking something in the wrong place. The player can embrace the frenzied flame by entering the underground area where the three fingers dwell, which requires removing all equipment before descending. This is one of the most striking requirements in the game. You cannot carry anything from your life into that encounter. You arrive naked and you receive the mark of the frenzied flame burned into your chest. The incantations you gain access to from this tradition are among the most powerful in the game, but the cost is enormous. If you have accepted the flame, you are locked into an ending where you burn away everything unless you can find a way to undo that mark. Lord of Frenzied Flame, the ending that Hieta prays for and the three fingers desire, is described as the end of all things and the beginning of a new age. In the context of the game's other endings, it is the most extreme, the most total, the one that offers no continuation of the current world in any form. It is the ultimate expression of the frenzied flame's nature. Not a bad ending in a moralistic sense exactly, but a fundamentally different kind of conclusion from every other path. Whether the new age that supposedly follows from it is better or worse than what came before is something the game wisely leaves ambiguous. The frenzied flame incantations as combat tools are interesting because they are not especially precise. They tend to be area attacks, spreading fire and madness in broad patterns rather than targeting specific points. This reflects the nature of the force they channel. The frenzied flame is not interested in surgical precision. It wants to reach everything. The spells that express it do the same. Black flame incantations, the power that can kill gods. Black flame incantations are the tradition associated with the Godskin Apostles and Godskin Nobles, the mysterious figures in black and white robes who appear throughout the game in places of power and significance. These beings exist to kill gods. That is their stated purpose, their tradition, their reason for being, and the magic they use reflects that purpose in a very direct way. Black Flame, the basic incantation of this tradition, deals fire damage with an unusual property. After striking, it continues to deal percentage-based damage to the target's health for a brief period. This is significant because percentage-based damage scales with maximum health, which means it is specifically effective against very large and very powerful targets. Against regular enemies, it is fine. Against bosses and godlike figures with enormous health pools, that ticking percentage damage is extremely potent. The design is lore accurate. Black Flame was developed to kill things that ordinary magic might struggle to harm. The Godskin Apostles have a deep connection to the Glowmide Queen, the figure we mentioned in the context of death sorceries. She preceded the current Golden Order's dominance and apparently posed a genuine threat to it with her Black Flame tradition. The Godskin Apostles are described as her warriors, her servants, the practitioners she gathered and trained. When Malekith defeated her and secured the Rune of Death, the Godskin Apostles were presumably scattered or driven underground. By the time of the game, the Godskin Apostles have found their way into a number of significant locations. They are in the Windmill Village, apparently holding a festival of some kind. They are in the Volcano Manor. They are at the peak of the Rolled Route. They have made themselves comfortable in places that suggest they are not merely survivors, but are actively pursuing an agenda even without their queen. Black Flame Ritual is one of the more spectacular spells in this tradition, creating a ring of black fire around the caster that deals continuous damage to everything within it. Black Flame's protection is a buff spell, which is unusual for an apparently offensive tradition, but makes sense when you consider that killing gods is a project that requires staying alive through extremely dangerous situations. The Apostles are not glass cannon fighters. They are resilient and adaptive, and their magic toolkit reflects that. The Black Blade incantations, associated specifically with Malekith and with the weapon he carries, are related to the Black Flame tradition, but with an additional element. Malekith's Black Blade and Destined Death, the incantations derived from his weapon, deal a mix of Black Flame damage and specifically strip away maximum health permanently for the duration of the fight. This is the Rune of Death aspect of his power bleeding through. He's not just burning gods, he is imposing the finality that the Rune of Death represents. The relationship between Malekith's tradition and the Glomide Queen's is worth thinking about carefully. He defeated her, but the tool he used to defeat her, the Rune of Death, is also the source of the Black Flame tradition's power. The Rune of Death makes death possible. Black Flame is the magic that exploits death's possibility to end even those who would otherwise be deathless. There is an uncomfortable circularity here. Malekith guards the very thing that makes the Godskin tradition dangerous. The Godskin Noble and Godskin Apostle enemy types have one of the most distinctive visual designs in the game. The Noble wears white robes and a pig-like mask. The Apostle wears black robes and a different mask, and is built more slenderly for acrobatic movement. Together, they represent the two faces of a tradition that is both contemplative and violent, that has developed its magic over a long time for a specific purpose, and has not deviated from that purpose, even as the world around it changed completely. Fire Giant incantations and the memory of the giants. The Fire Giants are one of the most ancient peoples mentioned in the game's lore. They predate the Golden Order, predate the Erd Tree's current dominance, and were apparently among the original stewards of the flame that became associated with the Forge of the Giants, the enormous fire heart at the mountaintop. The giants worshipped fire and the Fell God, and they carry an eye in their belly that the game describes as the vessel of the Fell God's gaze. This belly-eye connection links the fire giants to the frenzied flame tradition in a way that is not immediately obvious but becomes clear when you examine the lore carefully. The Fell God and the frenzied flame appear to be related or identical forces. The fire giants, in their worship of this entity, were practitioners of a kind of fire that is older and wilder than the Erd Tree's golden flame, closer to the burning dissolution that the three fingers represent. The Fire Giant boss fight at the Mountain of Giants is one of the most visually spectacular encounters in the game. The giant's size, the sweeping attacks, the eruptions of flame from his body, and from the frost-covered ground around him, all of it feels like fighting something geological rather than biological. The giants were not enemies to the Erd Tree in a political sense. They were the custodians of the Forge. The Erd Tree's servants needed the Forge to burn the Erd Tree, which is part of how the cycle of death and rebirth under the Elden Ring's lore was supposed to function. The giants kept that fire going. The Flame of the Fell God incantation, dropped by Aidan the Thief of Fire rather than by the fire giants directly, is the most direct expression of the giants' fire tradition. It calls down an immense fireball that lands and continues to burn and expand, a slow-moving, catastrophic impact rather than a quick strike. The description connects it to the same fell god that the giants worshipped. Ardan apparently stole this power, which fits the pattern of the frenzied flame tradition spread. Someone encountered this power, was drawn to it, and chose to take it regardless of the consequences. Flame of the Fell God is one of the few spells in the game that has a very specific arc and timing that rewards understanding over reaction. It lands slow, it expands big, and it deals immense damage if a target stands in it. This reflects the giants' nature as beings who operated on a different timescale from humans and from most other life in the lands between. They are slow to move but vast in effect. Their magic, when channeled by someone who does not share their scale, keeps that quality. It is not a magic for quick engagements. It is a magic for those willing to commit to something massive and patient. The Smith script shield's description and several other item descriptions fill in details about the giants' war with the Erd Tree and why the last giant, the one you fight, is maimed. The story that emerges is one of a people who were not evil but who were in the way, whose power and whose relationship to the fell god made them dangerous to the Erd Tree's project. They were defeated, not because they were wicked, but because they held fire that could not be allowed to remain independent. The last giant carries the wound of that defeat in his severed leg, crawling through the snow of the mountaintop like a catastrophe frozen in motion, lightning incantations and the Erd Tree's wrath. Lightning incantations occupy an interesting place in the faith-based magic hierarchy, because lightning, in the lands between, is associated with two distinct traditions that have different origins but have been partially merged in the current era. The first tradition is the ancient dragon lightning we discussed earlier, the primal storm-based power of Placidusax and the ancient dragons. The second is the more recent Erd Tree-affiliated lightning, the divine wrath that the Two Fingers and the Golden Order's knights can call down. The lightning spear family of incantations, honed bolt, electrify armament, Fortisax's lightning spear, fall within this category. Most of them are fairly straightforwardly about channeling lightning as a divine weapon. Theologically, they represent the Erd Tree's capacity for judgment. The Golden Order does not only protect and heal, it also strikes down those who oppose it. The lightning incantations are the striking down part. Fortisax's lightning spear is the most lore-significant individual spell in this category. Lich Dragon Fortisax is one of the most poignant figures in the game, a great dragon who chose to remain with Godwyn after Godwyn's partial death on the Night of the Black Knives. Rather than flee or fight, Fortisax descended into the Death Prince's domain and has been fighting a losing battle against the death corruption ever since, trying to preserve Godwyn's body even as it transforms into something increasingly alien. He is still there when you visit the realm of the Dead Prince, fighting shadows of himself, hopelessly stubborn in his loyalty. The spell named after him conjures twin lightning spears and hurls them at a target. It is powerful in straightforward terms, but carries enormous emotional weight as a lore artifact. This is the power of a dragon who chose friendship over survival, who has been fighting for someone who cannot be saved, who continues to resist a fate that has already been decided. Using Fortisax's lightning spear feels like invoking not just a force, but a conviction. Ancient Dragon Lightning Strike and Dragon Lightning Spear draw more explicitly on the pre-Erd Tree tradition, and their damage type and visual appearance reflect that ancestry. They are less golden warm and more cold blue, the colour of the sky in a true storm rather than the amber glow of the Erd Tree. The distinction in colour is not decorative, it is the game telling you which tradition you are accessing. Ancient Dragon Lightning can also apply the red lightning variant associated with some of the most ancient dragon forms. This red-tinged lightning appears in the Farum Azula encounters and feels genuinely older, more primal, more stripped of any divine ordering. It is lightning the way lightning was before anything tried to claim or organise it. The lightning damage, tear and arc spells in the more basic tiers of lightning incantation represent the accessible version of this tradition, the forms that a practitioner of reasonable faith and skill can learn and use without necessarily having a deep connection to the dragons or the ancient past. They are the currency of the tradition, widely usable and genuinely effective, even if they lack the historical resonance of the apex spells. Erd Tree incantations, the body of faith, made practical. Erd Tree incantations are the healing and buffing core of the faith-based magic system, and they represent what most ordinary believers in the Golden Order would understand as the practical benefits of their faith. Where the combat-oriented Golden Order incantations express the power of the Elden Ring as a law, the Erd Tree incantations express the Erd Tree as a source of life, restoration, and protection. The Erd Tree Heal family, from Basic Heal through Urgent Heal, Great Heal, and the Colossal Erd Tree Great Shield's specific healing art, represents the most direct and most commonly understood expression of Erd Tree power. Followers of the Erd Tree receive its grace in the form of healing, and this is what that looks like when someone has developed enough faith to access it deliberately and channel it at will. These spells heal because the Erd Tree has been positioned as the source of life itself in the lands between, and a believer who has developed sufficient connection to that source can draw healing from it. Rejection, the spell that sends a burst of Erd Tree energy forward, is interesting because it is described as a spell used by those who live in death to cleanse their corruption with Erd Tree power. This creates a slightly strange image, beings who are supposed to be outside the Erd Tree's grace, reaching for it anyway, using it as a cleanser rather than as a sustainer. It suggests that the Erd Tree's energy has a kind of objective quality that even those nominally excluded from its system can access under certain conditions. The Wrath of Gold incantation is the offensive end of the Erd Tree tradition, a golden explosion of Erd Tree energy centered on the caster. It is the force of the Elden Ring as absolute law expressing itself in a moment of overwhelming power. In law terms, it is the kind of thing you would expect a golden knight at the height of their power to be able to call down. The condensed faith of a lifetime of service to the greater will expressed in a single blast. Sacred Blade is a spell that infuses a weapon with Erd Tree energy for a duration, a buffing spell that makes sense in the context of the game's history. Faith-based warriors, Erd Tree knights, and their kin would want magic that enhanced their physical combat rather than replacing it. Sacred Blade does exactly that, adding the Erd Tree's power to whatever weapon the caster already uses. It is practical magic for practical believers. The blessings, boon, and blessing of the Erd Tree spells sit at the top of the healing tradition, providing sustained regen rather than burst healing. This is the magic of someone who has internalized the Erd Tree's energy deeply enough that they can provide a continuous flow of it to themselves and allies. The sustained character of these spells matches the sustained character of genuine faith as the game understands it. It is not a one-time dramatic intervention. It is a constant support that requires genuine investment. Rot and Scarlet, Rot incantations, the goddess of Rot. The Scarlet Rot incantations represent one of the most complicated magical traditions in the game because they draw on a force, the outer god of Rot, that is explicitly alien and explicitly beyond the understanding of those who serve it. The incantations associated with Scarlet Rot, Scarlet Aeonia, Rotten Breath, Exix's Decay, are all channeled through the Dragon Communion framework, but the Rot aspect is distinct enough to warrant separate consideration. The Scarlet Rot is associated with Malenia, the Blade of Miquella, one of the most tragic figures in the game. Malenia was born cursed. She carries within her the influence of the outer god of Rot, a being from beyond the world whose nature and goals are completely opaque to the inhabitants of the lands between. This Rot manifests in Malenia physically, her limbs replaced with the golden prosthetics because the Rot consumed her organic ones, and it manifests in her magic. When she reaches a certain point in her boss fight, she blooms, transforming into the goddess of Rot, and a giant scarlet Aeonia flower erupts from her in an explosion that fills the arena with rot-spreading spores. The Scarlet Aeonia incantation reproduces this event in a smaller form. The caster leaps into the air and comes down in a burst of rot energy, planting a flower of rot that continues to spread scarlet rot spores after the impact. It is one of the most visually beautiful and most cosmologically horrifying spells in the game. Beautiful because the rot flowers themselves are genuinely gorgeous in a terrible way. Horrifying because what they represent is the spread of an alien contamination that has already devastated Caelid and threatens to do the same to anything else it touches. Caelid, the blighted eastern region of the game, is what happens when the Scarlet Rot is unleashed without containment. It was once a functioning part of the lands between, connected to the cellular sorcery tradition we mentioned in the context of gravity magic. The war between Malenia and Radon ended with Malenia blooming, releasing a wave of rot that turned Caelid into the ruined wasteland you find it in. Radon was infected by the rot and driven partially mad. The entire region was transformed. This is not a small-scale disaster. It is a continental catastrophe caused by a single incantation. The outer god of rot's intentions, if it can be said to have intentions in any meaningful sense, are never stated clearly. But the game's treatment of rot as a spreading, consuming, transforming force suggests that it is less interested in the ongoing existence of the world than in its own propagation. Malenia is its vessel, someone who did not choose this connection but has had to live with it since birth. Her story is one of immense strength deployed against an internal force she cannot fully control. Every time she blooms, she is not choosing to spread rot. She is failing to contain something that is always trying to escape from her. The Rot Breath spell, accessible through the Dragon Communion system by using Exekiz's heart, is the most directly accessible version of this magic for the player. It breathes a cloud of scarlet rot at a target, building up the rot status effect that eventually deals a burst of damage and then continues to tick. In gameplay terms, it is extremely useful for breaking down tough enemies. In lore terms, it is channeling the power of a rotted dragon, a being that has been partially consumed by an alien god, and now breathes its influence outward. The Volcano Manor tradition and serpent worship. We touched on the Volcano Manor earlier in the context of magma sorceries, but it deserves more attention as a magical tradition in its own right, because the spells associated with Rykard and the serpent worshipping tradition go beyond simple magma manipulation. The Rykard's Rancor spell, which we mentioned, is the clearest example of the Blasphemous Lord's specific magical character. But there is also the Blasphemous Blade weapon and its skill, Taker's Flames, which draws fire and health from whatever it kills. This is the magic of a being who has merged with a god of consumption, who has adopted a philosophy of taking from others to sustain oneself. Rykard described his project as feeding his followers to the serpent so that, through consuming enough, they could gain a kind of immortality. This is not a metaphor, it is a literal description of what the god-devouring serpent does. The serpent sorcerer enemies in the Volcano Manor area cast a variety of spells that blend magma elements with something stranger, a corruption that feels organic and predatory rather than volcanic. They represent a sorcery tradition that has been warped by proximity to Rykard's project, to a being that is actively consuming and transforming everything around it. The Volcano Manor itself, as a location, is brilliantly designed as a space where the mundane and the monstrous coexist. Tanith and her guests behave with a kind of aristocratic normalcy, offering contracts, having meals, discussing strategy. But the basement contains a full-grown serpent god doing whatever it is doing down there, and the walls are permeated with a heat that no ordinary fire should produce. The magic used in and around Volcano Manor reflects that duality. On the surface, it looks like ordinary, if heretical sorcery and pyromancy. Underneath, it is something that has been feeding on divinity and growing in ways that even its practitioners may not fully understand. Rykard's specific rejection of the Eared Tree, his choice to seek a path to godhood through consumption rather than through grace, places his tradition in sharp contrast to the Golden Order incantations. The Golden Order's magic is about receiving grace and channeling it outward in service of an ordered system. Rykard's magic is about taking, consuming, incorporating. It is the opposite philosophy expressed through the same fundamental tool of faith-based power, turned inside out. The Halig tree and the dream of pure gold. The Halig tree incantations, associated with Miquella and his project to create an alternative Erd tree, represent one of the game's most poignant, what might have been threads. Miquella was, by most accounts, the most gifted demigod in the current age. He developed the unalloyed gold needle, a tool capable of removing the influence of outer gods from individuals, which he developed specifically to cure his twin sister, Melania, of the scarlet rot. He planted the Halig tree as a project to create a place of sanctuary for those rejected by the Erd tree, those who were cursed, those who were different, those who were excluded. The spells associated with the Halig tree area and with the figures connected to Miquella, particularly the Elden Stars incantation and the Golden Order spells used by the Erd tree believers in his service, carry a quality of aspiration and tenderness that is unusual for combat magic. Miquella's project was fundamentally compassionate in its stated intent. The unalloyed gold power he developed was designed to protect people from things that should not be able to touch them. Miquella himself was taken by Mohg before the game's events, pulled into the Blood Palace in a coma. Mohg, the Lord of Blood, saw in Miquella's potential the opportunity to consecrate a new age of his dynasty. Whether Mohg understood Miquella's own project or cared about it is doubtful. He saw power and took it. What Miquella might have accomplished with the Halig tree fully developed is something the game does not answer, only implies. The Clean Rot Knight enemies who serve Melania and are associated with the Halig tree use a distinctive combination of combat style and magic that includes cleansing rot damage from themselves and their weapons. This is a practical expression of the unalloyed gold tradition, the application of Miquella's anti-corruption magic to real combat conditions. They are fighting to protect a Melania who cannot be cured, using a tool developed to cure her. The Erd tree seal, the highest level sacred seal in the game, is associated with the Erd tree in its general sense, but gains specific resonance in the context of the Halig tree. It is a tool of pure faith, and the figure of Miquella is one of the game's most complex arguments for what faith, in the best sense, might look like. Not the rigid authority of the two fingers, but the genuine care of a being trying to use their extraordinary gifts to protect those who have been left behind. Death blight and those who live in death. Before we conclude our tour of the magic systems, we need to address the death blight status effect and the broader phenomenon of those who live in death, because it represents a kind of magic that is more condition than tradition, and yet permeates the world of the lands between in ways that touch nearly every other magic category we have discussed. Those who live in death are the undead of the lands between, people whose souls were not recycled by the Erd tree's system, who exist in a state that should not be possible under the Golden Order's framework. They are technically a violation of the Elden Ring's law, which is why the Golden Order sends its knights to purge them, and why the Litany of Proper Death is a spell specifically designed to deal with them. Their existence is evidence that the system has been breaking down for a long time, that the removal of the Rune of Death and the events of the Night of the Black Knives created ruptures in the normal functioning of the world's death cycle. The magic associated with them, ghost flame, explosive ghost flame, the blue fire that burns cold rather than hot, is the energy of death improperly contained. It is what happens when the Rune of Death's energy leaks into the world without the proper channels to guide it. The ghost flame is not controlled or channeled through any tradition. It simply accumulates wherever death has been denied its proper expression. The death root itself, which feeds Gurunk and which drives the Tibia Mariner enemies to sail their phantom ships around the lands between ringing bells, is the physical form of this accumulated death energy. It grows from the bodies of the improperly dead, a black root system that carries the Rune of Death's residual power. It is simultaneously dangerous and useful. Dangerous because it corrupts the area around it and creates more of those who live in death. Useful because Gurranq, by eating it, is neutralizing it in the one way that seems to work. The Deathbird enemies, enormous and terrifying, are the keepers of what should have been the proper death transition. They guide souls. But with the system broken, they are wandering without clear purpose, massive and dark and cold, still performing gestures of guidance for a destination that no longer clearly exists. Their magic, the cold death touch they inflict, is another expression of the same ghost flame, the fire that should warm the dead on their passage, but now just burns because there is nowhere for the burning to lead. The rune of death's leak into the world thus creates a shadow magic system, not one that anyone designed or teaches or learns from a master. It is simply what death improperly contained produces, and it is everywhere in the lands between, in the caves and catacombs, on the shores where the Tibia mariners sail, in the fog where the deathbirds walk. It is the ambient evidence of a world that is not working the way it was supposed to work. Black Knife incantations and the Knight of Knives. The Black Knife assassins deserve a more extended discussion than they have received so far, because their magic is unique in the game, operating at the intersection of several traditions in a way that reflects the deliberate, coordinated nature of the Knight of the Black Knives. The Black Knife weapon and the associated weapon skills work using a magic that looks like night sorcery in its aesthetic but delivers death blight and damage in a manner consistent with the rune of death's influence. The skill Blade of Death fires a crescent of dark energy that immediately deducts a portion of the target's maximum health, not their current health, but their maximum. This is a direct echo of Malekith's power, the destined death that strips away the possibility of life, rather than just the current quantity of it. How did the Black Knives come to possess this power? The game suggests they were given knives imbued with a fragment of the Rune of Death through Ranni's coordination. This required someone to take the rune from Malekith's safekeeping, or at least a fragment of it, which speaks to the extraordinary nature of the plan and the extraordinary level of access that Ranni or her collaborators must have had. The Black Knife assassins themselves are described as all being women of a particular Numen bloodline. Marika is also of Numen descent. This bloodline connection is suggestive of a particular affinity, or perhaps a particular permission, within the system. Numen descent may grant a closer connection to the fundamental laws of the world, making them better conduits for the death magic the knives carry. Or it may simply mean they were the group in whom Ranni had sufficient trust to share the plan. Their magic in combat, as enemy types you encounter in Night's Sacred Ground and in the Catacombs, combines extraordinary speed and agility with the death edge of their blades. They are not brawlers. They are precision instruments designed for a specific job, and the magic they carry reflects that design. The Rune of Death fragment is not something they channel through study or through faith. It is literally in their weapon, applied externally, a loaded device rather than an internalized tradition. This makes the Black Knife magic unique in the game's taxonomy. It is not sorcery in the glintstone sense. It is not incantation in the devotional sense. It is magic as tool, magic as artifact, magic as a charge loaded into a physical object and released by skilled application. The closest analogy is a sealed rune on a weapon, but the Rune of Death is not just any rune. It is the fundamental law of mortality itself, and having a fragment of it wedged into a blade is an act so significant that the Knight of the Black Knives is still reshaping the world at the time you play through the game. The sorceries and talismans as magical focus, while not spell traditions in themselves, the sorceries and various talismans in the game represent a kind of externalized magic that deserves acknowledgement in a comprehensive discussion of magic types. The Radagon Soreseal and Marika's Soreseal, for example, are described as seals placed on the bearer by divine authority. They increase multiple attributes simultaneously, but also increase damage taken. They are simultaneously a boon and a burden, a grace that comes with a cost. The language around saw seals positions them as active magical objects, not passive stat enhancers, but actual seals that are doing something. Radagon's seal increases physical attributes. Marika's increases mental and faith-based ones. This reflects the nature of their creators. Radagon was a warrior scholar, physically powerful, and magically gifted in the glintstone tradition. Marika was the Elden Lord's vessel, the conduit for grace and the source of the Golden Order's legitimate authority. That both of them created seals that impose a cost alongside their benefit is interesting in the context of the game's overall philosophy. Nothing in the lands between is free. The Elden Ring itself, the fundamental law, operated on exchange. The crucible required something to be given. The rune of death was locked away at a cost. Even the grace that guides the tarnished is described as something being spent, a resource with a direction rather than an infinite gift. The saw seals fit into this economy. They give a lot, they take something back. The celestial dew and the absolution of magic. There is one more element of the game's magical framework that is worth addressing before we reach the end of our journey through these traditions, and that is the concept of absolution and the rivers of scarlet rot that function as something like anti-magic in certain contexts. The Church of Vows, which holds the giant turtle Archbishop Miriel, offers absolution in exchange for celestial dew. The absolution mechanic in the game is about restoring broken relationships with NPCs, resetting hostilities. But in the broader lore context, it touches on something the game hints at throughout. The idea that magic and the laws it represents can be undone, reversed, forgiven. The celestial dew is described as condensed tears of stars, starlight again, the substance of the cosmos as a cleanser. This connects back to where we began. Glintstone is crystallized starlight. Oracle bubbles come from the finger ruins connected to the stars. The Golden Order's ultimate magic, Elden Stars, invokes a rain from above. Ancient dragon lightning comes from the storm, above Farum Azula, close to the sky. Even the frenzied flame which seeks to burn everything is described in terms of a heat that rises and expands. All of the magic in the lands between, in different ways, reaches upward. Toward the sky, toward the stars, toward whatever exists beyond them. The world of Elden Ring is a world in which the sky is not empty or neutral. It is alive with significance, with forces that occasionally dip down into the world in ways that the inhabitants can access if they know how. The sorceries reach up through intellect. The incantations reach up through devotion. The aberrant traditions reach up through madness or surrender. But the direction is the same. The magic is always, in some sense, a conversation between the lands between and whatever is out there above the clouds, in the space between stars, in the places that even Marika's architecture could not map or claim. That is perhaps the most interesting thing about all of these magic systems taken together. They are not just tools in a fantasy game. They are different answers to the same question that every civilization in the lands between was asking. What is out there? How do we reach it? What do we become when we do? The Academy of Raya Lucaria said, study it. The Carian said, inherit it. The primeval sorcerers said, chase it to the edge of what a person can survive. The Golden Order said, receive it with proper gratitude. The frenzied flame said, let it consume you entirely. The Dragon Communion said, eat it. The Godskins said, use it to end the things that call themselves eternal. None of them are entirely wrong. None of them are entirely right. The Elden Ring is shattered, which means the fundamental law that was supposed to adjudicate between them is gone. And into that space steps the Tarnished, carrying all of these traditions simultaneously, a person with access to every magic in the history of the lands between, who has to decide what to do with it. That is the game. That is what all of this magic was building toward. Not a curriculum or a doctrine or a single truth, but a choice made by someone who has finally seen every answer that was ever proposed, and now has to live with whichever one they pick. And maybe that is enough for tonight to rest with. The knowledge that every spell you cast in the lands between has a history, a tragedy, a name, that Gurranq eating deathroot in the dark, that Renala cradling her amber egg, that Raden holding back the stars with gravity sorceries so a horse could carry him, that Malenia blooming into rot because she could not stop herself anymore. All of that is in the spells. All of that is what you are holding when you raise a staff or a seal and reach towards something you cannot quite name. The stars are still up there, the magic is still moving, and the night is very long. The sorcery schools within Raya Lucaria, divisions and rivalries. When we talk about Raya Lucaria as the home of glintstone sorcery, it is easy to imagine it as a monolithic institution with a single set of values and a unified approach to magical study. But the reality that the game suggests is considerably more complex and considerably more interesting. The Academy of Raya Lucaria, over its long history, developed internal schools of thought, subgroups of scholars who emphasized different aspects of glintstone study and sometimes came into open conflict with each other over questions of method and priority. The clearest evidence of this internal diversity is the range of sorceries available in the game itself. They do not all represent the same philosophical approach. The basic projection spells, the glintstone pebble and its family, are the bread and butter of the curriculum, accessible, understood, teachable. But then you have the more complex geometries of spells like the glintstone arc and the Carian slicer, which require a different set of assumptions about how the energy behaves. And then you have the comet tradition, which makes claims about the cosmological origins of glintstone energy that not every member of the faculty would have endorsed. These are not just variations in application, they reflect genuine differences in theory. The sorcerer Rogier, who you encounter in the early game and who has a questline connected to the Black Knife discoveries, is an interesting example of a practitioner who sits at the intersection of several traditions. He studied at the Academy, clearly, given his command of standard glintstone sorceries, but his specific area of obsession, the Black Knife conspiracy and the nature of Deathroot, has pulled him toward the edges of what the Academy would recognize as legitimate scholarship. His arc in the game is one of a scholar who followed the evidence wherever it led, even when it led somewhere the institution would have preferred not to go. The school of sorcerers you encounter in the Academy dungeon itself, the various enemies you fight through the campus, represent different levels of academic achievement and different specializations. The basic glintstone sorcerers are students or junior scholars. The crystalline hybrids in some areas suggest experimentation at the intersection of human sorcery and crystalline magic. The larger abductor virgins and the more elaborate enemies suggest a side of the Academy that was always pushing into territory that would be called applied rather than theoretical, not just studying how the energy works, but building things with it. The most disturbing example of this applied tradition is the abductor mechanism itself. These enormous iron maidens that stalk the dungeon and the volcano manor are constructed devices that carry sorcery as a component of their function. They are not alive in any normal sense, but they are not simply mechanical either. The sorcery that drives them is clearly Academy-derived. Someone at some point in the Academy's history decided that the best application of their theoretical understanding of glintstone energy was building giant iron torture devices that swallow and grind their victims. This is not in the curriculum as most students would have encountered it. It is a product of a particular school of thought within the institution that had a very different idea of what the Academy's magic was for. The meteorite and the question of origin. The meteorite staff, which we mentioned briefly in the context of gravity sorceries, is worth returning to in a more detailed way because it points at a question that runs through all of the sorcery traditions in the game. Where does glintstone actually come from in enough quantity to supply an entire civilization of sorcerers? The obvious answer is that it falls from the sky. Glintstone is crystallized starlight. Stars occasionally send material down into the world in the form of meteor impacts. Glintstone deposits build up wherever those impacts occurred. The Academy sits in a region with presumably high concentrations of glintstone precisely because of the geological history of the area, the evidence of past impacts, or perhaps of a single, very significant celestial event. But the deeper question is what the relationship between the rate of use and the rate of supply looks like. If glintstone is being consumed by the Academy's scholars in massive quantities, forged into staves and equipment and buildings, channeled into spells and studies, it must be replenished somehow. Either the deposits are enormous enough that depletion is not a practical concern, or new material is arriving regularly, or something is regenerating the glintstone in ways that the game does not fully explain. The founding Reign of Stars incantation, as we discussed, invokes a primeval meteor shower. There is a suggestion in its description that such events happened more frequently in ancient times, that the lands between was once much more actively bombarded by stellar material than it is now. If true, this would explain the large deposits that the Academy's history apparently required. The primeval era was a time of cosmic fertility, of constant input from the stars above. The current era, under the Erd tree's organizing influence, is more stable but also more static, less input from above, more reliance on what was already deposited. This cosmological dynamic, the Erd tree as a force of stabilization that cuts the lands between off from the more active cosmic influence of earlier times, actually aligns with a lot of the game's broader thematic concerns. The Golden Order presents itself as an improvement over the chaos of the primeval era, but improvement for whom and at what cost? The primeval sorcerers who followed the comets to the edge of human endurance were accessing something immensely powerful. The Academy systematized and made safe a portion of what they found. Safety and systematization are not neutral goods. They come at the cost of the wildness and possibility that the primeval current represented. The glintstone crown tradition and what scholars sacrifice. One of the subtler aspects of glintstone sorcery that comes through in item descriptions rather than in explicit narrative is the tradition of wearing glintstone crowns. Many of the scholar enemies in Raya Lucaria and in the broader world wear headpieces that incorporate glintstone directly into their design, often embedding the stone near the head, near the face, near the eyes. The player can also equip various versions of these crowns, each with slightly different effects. The descriptions of these items are where things get interesting. Several of them explicitly state that wearing the crown comes at a cost. The Olivinus glintstone crown, the Carolos glintstone crown, the Radagon scarseal analogue for sorcerers in the form of the twin sage glintstone crown. These items note that the proximity of the glintstone to the brain has effects on the bearer. They enhance intelligence, they sometimes reduce vitality or endurance, and in some cases they seem to suggest that the relationship between the scholar and the stone is becoming more intimate in ways that are not entirely voluntary. This is an extension of what we noted earlier about the glintstone embedded directly in senior scholars' foreheads. The practice of incorporating glintstone into what you wear and eventually into your body is not just symbolism or fashion. It is a progressive merging of the scholar with the substance they study. The stone changes them. The long-term exposure to crystallized starlight alters how they think, how they perceive, possibly how they are constituted at a fundamental level. The crystallians, as we discussed, are what you get when this process goes all the way. They are beings who are fully integrated with crystalline matter. Whether the earliest crystallians were once scholars who pushed the merging too far, or whether they evolved independently from different starting conditions, is something the game does not answer clearly. But the spectrum from scholar wearing a stone crown, to scholar with glintstone in their forehead, to crystalline is coherent enough to be worth noting. The Academy's tradition of glintstone study may be heading, in its extremes, toward a kind of speciation. Different enough beings from ordinary humans that the question of whether they still share concerns or interests is genuinely open. Lusat, Azur, and the fate of those who went too far. We have mentioned Lusat and Azur in the context of primeval sorceries, but their individual stories deserve more attention because they represent the two possible outcomes for a sorcerer who chooses to pursue the primeval current beyond what institutional scholarship will countenance. Azur, whose specific fate is less clearly described in the game, is associated with the Comet Azur spell, and with a legendary journey to find the comet's landing site. The description of the staff of the guilty and related items suggests that Azur was expelled from Raya Lucaria for his pursuit of the primeval current, or perhaps that he left voluntarily when the institution refused to follow where his research was leading. Either way, the break with the Academy was complete. He pursued the comet, he found it, and he apparently survived the encounter long enough to formalize what he found into the sorcery that bears his name. Lusat's fate is more vividly portrayed because you can actually find him. He is in the Celia hideaway, a cave in Caelid, accessible through a hidden wall. When you reach him, he is sitting motionless in a chamber, surrounded by enormous glintstone crystals. Clearly not dead, but equally clearly not entirely present in the ordinary sense. His eyes, if he has them visible, are completely filled with glintstone light. He has gone far enough into the primeval current that he exists in a state somewhere between scholar and crystal, between human and the cosmic energy he spent his life studying. He can still give you his incantation Stars of Ruin if you have the Academy glintstone key required to reach him, and he provides it without apparent difficulty. Whatever he has become, he has not lost his capacity to transmit knowledge, but the transmission feels like it comes from somewhere very far away. Like the knowledge has been waiting in him for a long time, maintained in the crystalline state his body has partially become, and giving it to you is the last active thing he expected to do. This is one of the most powerful images in the entire game for the danger and the allure of extreme scholarship. Lusat found what he was looking for. He found the primeval current at its source, and the cost was that he became part of it. He is no longer pursuing the current. He is, in some sense, inside it. Whether that is tragedy or apotheosis, the game refuses to say. The contrast with Azur is illuminating. Azur survived his encounter with the comet in a form that apparently still resembled a functional person, functional enough to create a spell, to have disciples, to leave behind a tradition that others could find and continue. The encounter took something from him, certainly. The empty posture of the figure you find where Azur apparently made his final camp suggests someone who was deeply changed by what they found. But he retained coherence. He retained the ability to encode his discovery into a form that others could use. Lusat went further and became something that can barely be said to be encoding anything at all. He is just presence now, just the state of being saturated with what he found. The night's sacred ground and what it guards. The night's sacred ground, accessible in the Nocron Eternal City, is one of the most atmosphere-dense locations in the game, and one of the most significant for understanding several intersecting magic traditions. It is here that you find the Finger Slayer blade, the weapon designed to harm the fingers, the 2 fingers, and presumably 3 fingers, whose guidance or manipulation sits at the heart of the land's between political structure. The fact that this weapon exists at all is extraordinary. The 2 fingers are not supposed to be killable things. They are messengers of the greater will, intermediaries between a cosmic power and the mortal world. The existence of a blade designed to harm them suggests that at some point, someone both had the knowledge that they could be harmed and the motivation to create a tool for doing so. The Finger Slayer blade, in the Numen traditions, in the Night Sorcery traditions, in Rani's plan, All of these threads converge on this one object, hidden in a place that the eternal city of Nokron guards carefully. The Black Knife Assassins, who we know, were involved in the Night of the Black Knives, and who are connected to the Numen bloodline and to Night sorcery, are present in force in the Night's sacred ground. Their presence here suggests that this location has significance to their tradition, beyond just the storage of the blade. Perhaps they came here to train. Perhaps the perpetual night of the underground was necessary for the development of their particular magic. Perhaps the Fingerslayer blade's proximity enhanced or enabled certain aspects of the death magic their knives carry. The Eternal Cities, Nokron and Nokstella, are underground civilizations that existed parallel to the surface world's history. They developed their own relationship to the stars, to glintstone, to the forces from beyond the world. Their position underground, permanently in artificial twilight, surrounded by the stars that the game displays on the ceilings of their great chambers, shaped their magic in ways that are still not fully mapped. The star-scattered ceilings of Nokstella are described as artificial, a recreation of the night sky inside a buried world. This is not just decoration, it is infrastructure for a society that depended on starlight magic and could not access the actual sky. The Albinauric creation and the ethics of magical life. The Albinaurics are one of the most complex created peoples in the game's lore, and their creation touches on a dimension of magic use that most of the game's traditions skirt around without fully addressing. He believes in the Erd Tree with complete sincerity, serves it without reservation, and receives from it only the designation of cursed and unwanted. His dedication is not rewarded, and he knows it is not rewarded, and he maintains it anyway. The magic that flows from his omen nature is his alone, not granted by the Erd Tree he serves, existing despite everything the Order has made him into. Mohg's blood rite and the ritual magic of Dynasty Foundation. The Morgwyn Dynasty Mausoleum, where you eventually fight Morg the Lord of Blood, is designed as a ritual space rather than as a simple dungeon or castle. The architecture speaks to ceremony, to a specific sequence of events that Morg intended to enact in this space with Miquella as the intended centre. Understanding the ritual helps understand the blood magic tradition in its most ambitious expression. Morg discovered, or was contacted by the outer god, of the Formless Mother, and received from her the gift of Blood Flame, or alternatively, received Blood Flame first and through it drew the Formless Mother's attention. Either way, the tradition he developed is deeply tied to her patronage and to her specific kind of power, which operates through blood, through violation, through the transgression of the boundaries between living things. The Dynasty Mausoleum was designed to be the birthplace of a new age, with Morg as its founder and Miquella as its consecrated divinity. Morg's plan was to put Miquella through some kind of awakening ritual that would bring him out of his deep sleep and into awareness as a god under Morg's patronage. The blood magic of the ceremony, which you see the aftermath of when you enter the mausoleum and find Miquella's arm still extending from the cocoon, was the method for this awakening. Whether the ritual was working is unclear. Miquella is still asleep when you arrive, but the mausoleum and the ceremony suggest that blood magic in Mohg's tradition is not just about combat application or physical effect, it is about transformation on a cosmological scale. The blood flame tradition contains within it a theory of how change works, how a new order begins, how an old age ends and a new one starts. It is a foundational magic in the most literal sense, an attempt to lay foundations for something that has not existed before. The Formless Mother herself is, like all the outer gods in the game, almost entirely opaque in terms of her own understanding or intentions. She has no spoken lines. She has no clearly described form. She has a presence that manifests as blood and as a kind of maternal consuming, a hungry thing that gives blood magic as a gift, the way that predators give their young the first taste of a kill. Her patronage of Mohg's tradition is real in the sense that the magic works and that Mohg clearly receives some form of support or communication from her. But whether she wants what Mohg wants, whether his dynasty-founding plans align with whatever she is actually after, is something the game cannot tell you. Goldmask's theology and the fundamentalist incantations. We touched on Goldmask and Corin earlier, but the fundamentalist tradition deserves a much more extended treatment because it represents one of the game's most intellectually interesting magic developments. Goldmask is described as a legendary figure who has devoted his life to uncovering the true nature of the Elden Ring as a universal law, stripped of the personal and the political and reduced to something like pure principle. The fundamentalist position is essentially that the Golden Order, as it exists, is a corruption of a more perfect law. The Elden Ring is real, and its law is real, but the institutional expression of that law in the Golden Order, with its finger readers and its two fingers, and its Erdtree-centered theology, has imported too much contingency, too much personality, too much that depends on specific relationships between specific beings. Goldmask wants to recover what the law would look like if it were purified of all this personal dependency. His incantations, the law of causality and law of regression, are expressions of this purified approach to law. Causality says that actions have consequences and that the law enforces those consequences directly, without needing any divine intermediary. If you damage someone enough times, the law requires that they suffer proportionally. Regression says that false forms should return to their true ones, that illusions and transformations violate the law, and the law can correct them. These are not appeals to a personal god. They are applications of universal principle. Corin, who begins as a straightforward priest of the Golden Order, and who follows Goldmask across the Altus Plateau in an attempt to understand and serve his research, undergoes a significant journey through the questline. He goes from institutional functionary to genuine intellectual companion to something at the end that the game suggests is quite broken. Goldmask apparently found what he was looking for, assembled from the game's lore fragments a complete vision of the purified law, and then Goldmask burned. The mending rune of perfect order, associated with Goldmask's ending, takes the purified law and mends the shattered Elden Ring with it. The result, in lore terms, should be a more perfect version of the Golden Order, one built on universal principle rather than on political contingency. Whether this is actually better is something the game does not answer. Perfect order is not the same as good order. A perfectly enforced law can be perfectly unjust. Corin's eventual state, which you find him in at the end of the questline, if you follow it through, shows someone who pursued wisdom to a point that cost them everything recognizably comfortable. He assisted in a project of genuine intellectual courage and ended up on the other side of it holding something that does not look like victory from the outside. The fundamentalist incantations are the magic of this specific kind of sacrifice. They are the spells of people who chose understanding over comfort and found that understanding has its own kind of price. The rune of death and where it actually lives. Throughout this video, we have discussed the rune of death in fairly abstract terms as something that Marika removed from the Elden Ring and that Malekith guards. But where does it physically live in the game? And what does that tell us about the nature of the magic associated with it? Malekith carries the rune of death within himself. The black blade, his weapon, is the physical expression of this. The sword can inflict what the game calls destined death, a specifically final death that does not allow the soul to persist in any form and that reduces maximum health as a representation of the vital capacity being permanently stripped away. This is a weapon that is doing to its targets what the rune of death was supposed to do as part of the world's fundamental law, imposing the finality that was removed when the rune was taken out of the Elden Ring. The fact that this finality is now carried in a sword rather than in the ring is significant. The rune was a law of the world. Now it is a weapon of a specific being. It has been personalized. It has been weaponized. What was once a universal principle applicable to everyone equally is now a tool that Malekith can apply at his own discretion in service of Marika's agenda against specific targets. This personalization of universal law is one of the game's most consistent themes. The Elden Ring's shattering has taken its laws out of their universal context and distributed them into specific hands, where they become tools rather than principles. The Rune of Death in Malekith's sword is the most dramatic example, but it is not the only one. Every great rune carried by a demigod represents a piece of universal law that has been taken and personalized, that now serves one particular agenda rather than all agendas equally. The death sorceries that practitioners develop outside of Malekith's direct authority are working with the leakage from this process. Some of the Rune of Death has escaped from its containment through the events of the Night of the Black Knives, through the death root phenomenon, through the failures of the world's basic maintenance systems. That escaped rune energy is what the death sorceries channel. They are using a piece of universal law that has become ambient, that has pooled in certain places, and can be accessed by those who know what to look for. This makes death sorceries uniquely politically interesting. They are magic derived from a universal law, the same ultimate principle that Malekith's sword expresses, but accessed through the leakage from a failed system rather than through legitimate authority. They are not granted, they are found, and finding them does not require serving anyone or believing in anything. It just requires going to the places where death energy has accumulated and being willing to channel it. The Finger Ruins and Pre-Erdtree magic systems. The Finger Ruins are one of the most intriguing environments in the game, precisely because they represent a period of the world's history that even the most detailed lore fragments barely touch. They are ancient, clearly predating the Erdtree's establishment, and they are connected to the two fingers in a way that suggests the fingers were present or worshipped, or at least significant in the world, long before the current Golden Order arrangements. The ruins in the mountaintops of the Giants area and the ones accessible through Mohg's Palace region have the same aesthetic vocabulary, a kind of alien geometric architecture that does not match any of the more familiar building styles in the game. They were built by someone, or something, operating from a completely different set of assumptions than the cultures that came later. The magic associated with them, what little can be inferred, is closer to the oracle bubble tradition than to anything else, a strange floating power that is neither clearly sorcery nor clearly incantation, but something that predates that distinction. The Finger Ruins raise the question of what the lands between was like before the Greater Will's involvement. The game suggests that the Greater Will came from outside the world, that its influence on the Elden Ring and the Two Fingers was an imposition rather than a growth from within. If the Finger Ruins predate this, they represent a moment when whatever the Two Fingers are was already present in the world but operating in a different context, connected to a power structure that the game has almost entirely erased from the historical record. The Outer Gods as a category of being that includes the Greater Will, the Rot God, the Formless Mother, and whatever is connected to the Frenzied Flame. All seem to operate from outside the world, and all seem to have magic traditions that are in some sense their personal expression, rather than traditions that arose organically from the lands between's own history. The Finger Ruins suggest that the Greater Will's involvement with the world is older than it might appear, that the fingers were already there, already shaping, or at least touching the world, before the Elden Ring was made and before Marika became the vessel for the current arrangement. Ash of War as cultural survival, the Ashes of War system, as we noted earlier, represents a distributed form of magic that survived the collapse of the institutions that might have organised it. But the survival of specific ashes of war carries specific cultural information about the traditions that produced them. Stormblade and Storm Assault, the ashes of war associated with the storm magic of Stormvale Castle, and Godric's tradition, survive even though the castle itself is a ruin, and Godric's grafting project was one of the most chaotic and least organised expressions of any tradition in the game. Storm magic, with its connection to the ancient dragon lightning tradition, and to the early wind and storm forces that predate the Erd Tree, has a residual life in these weapon arts, even though no institution currently teaches it. Carrion Retaliation, the Ash of War, that deflects magic projectiles using Carrion sorcery, shaped through a shield, suggests that the Carrion tradition of defensive magic had a weapon-integrated application that was made broadly distributable. You can acquire this ash without going through the Carrion royal family or the academy. It is just out in the world, available to anyone who finds it. The tradition survived its practitioners. Flame of the Fell God as an ash of war does not exist, but the fire giant's magic does persist in the Fell God incantation we discussed. The survival of this specific fire in the world of the game, attached to Adan the Thief, available to the player after his death, is a statement about the persistence of the Fell God's influence even after the defeat of its most prominent worshippers. Fire from the belly of a fallen civilization, still burning. The Golden Vow Ash of War is one of the most interesting in this context because it converts to a full incantation elsewhere in the game. The same magical effect, a buff that increases attack and defense, exists in both the weapon skill format and the faith-based incantation format. This dual existence suggests that the Golden Order's buff magic was so well established that it was integrated into both the martial and the clerical traditions, accessible through both the fighter's craft and the priest's practice. The vow transcended its original context and became part of the general toolkit. The Godskin Needle and its implications. The Godskin Needle, a thin thrusting weapon, has a description that tells you something specific and important about the Godskin tradition. It was made to pierce the most essential part of the Godskins, to paralyze rather than kill, to render them unable to perform their god-killing function without destroying the practitioner. This implies that the Godskin apostles and nobles are not simply killed by ordinary means, which is consistent with the experience of fighting them in the game, where they take significant amounts of damage before going down. But more importantly, it implies that someone, at some point in the history of the lands between, developed a tool specifically for neutralizing the Godskin tradition. Someone took the Gloam-eyed Queen's warriors seriously enough as a threat to develop a counter-tool. Who made the Godskin Needle? The description does not say definitively, but the implication is that it was made by someone working in service of the things the Godskin apostles were threatening. In other words, someone working for the gods or for the beings adjacent to the Elden Ring. This is a fascinating counterpoint to the narrative of the Godskin tradition as the oppressed and suppressed alternative magic system. They were suppressed, yes, but they were also genuinely dangerous, and their opponents took them seriously enough to develop very specific tools for neutralizing them. The Godskin Stitcher, another weapon in the same aesthetic family, extends this further. It is designed for the seam work of the black cloth that covers the Godskin practitioners, the specific material of their tradition. You fight against something associated with the divine. You use the very cloth of the divine killers as your weapon. The magic here is subtle but real, the power embedded in materials and in tradition rather than in spells and incantations. The power of remembrance, spells and why they matter to lore. We mentioned remembrances earlier, but did not fully explore what the specific spells derived from them tell us about the beings they came from. Let us go through some of the most significant spell form remembrances and what the spells themselves, in their design and description, reveal. Radan's remembrance becomes either the two curved swords or the Star Scourge Radan gravity sorceries, gravity well, and collapsing stars. The fact that these are the combat spells associated with his remembrance, rather than the more spectacular meteorite or rock-sling spells, suggests something about which of his magical capabilities were most essentially his. The basic gravity manipulation, the pull and the collapse, are the core of what he was. Everything else built on that. Renala's remembrance becomes the Renala's full moon spell, or the Sword of Night and Flame. The full moon spell is obviously the direct expression of her tradition. The Sword of Night and Flame is more interesting, a weapon that combines Carian night sorcery and flame in a single artifact. It is the weapon of someone who could bridge traditions that seem opposed, a sorcerer from the House of the Moon who could also command fire.